See, I forgot to bring myself up on stage. Habari gani, karibuni. We are here to read again How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so we got to chapter 4 last week. We didn't finish chapter 4, so we're going to be starting from chapter 4 and then continue on to chapter 5. Yeah, we had a little bit of chapter 4 left. I'm just trying to see. I'm not sure we'll be able to finish chapter 5 today, but we will do our best to do that. Just want to make sure I remember where we stopped on chapter 4. I believe it was the coming of imperialism and colonialism. Yeah. Okay. So again, thanks to, and let me just put the Walter Rodney website here so that you can all reach out, visit the site and see how you can help, how you can take action. We thank them again for giving us the permissions to go ahead and read the book online and make it available and accessible to more people. Again, the book is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. If you're African, find a Black bookstore near you and buy it if you can buy it. We have the holidays coming up, buy it as a gift. We have Kwanzaa coming up, buy it as a gift. For those of you who practice or observe Kwanzaa, buy this as a gift to help decolonize your family, your friends' minds, fellow African minds. Please go ahead and find a Black bookstore where you can buy this. If you're in the New Jersey area, we have the source of the New Jersey, close to New York area. We have the source of knowledge in Newark. You can buy the book from there. If you're in the DC area, we have Sankofa bookstore in DC. You can buy the book from there. I'm sure you can Google and search in your neighborhood or in a near state, or even you can order to be delivered. Sankofa does deliver. I do order books from there sometimes. So Sankofa delivers throughout the US. You can order the book from them if you don't have a Black bookstore near you. But again, if you're in the Newark area, close to New York, you can order the book or visit the bookstore, the source of knowledge in Newark, and get the book. Again, the website is running at the bottom of the screen for those of you who are interested in participating in the movement of African liberation, helping in the work that is going on with the different organizations, and showing thanks to the Walter Rodney Foundation for allowing us to read this book and provide it to the masses, make it more accessible. Please visit the Walter Rodney Foundation website on the bottom where you can take action. They have the different ways you can take action listed there. So we're going to start again from chapter 4 where we left off, the coming of imperialism and colonialism, and then go on to chapter 5. And hopefully we will finish chapter 5 today. If not, we'll stop at 12 o'clock and continue where we stop off. All right. Okay. Habari gani, peace to you, Muata Garai. It's just you and I for now, but I'm sure others will stop by. Either way, it's good that we have this recorded for the community to find it. Share it, please. And we start. In the centuries before colonial rule, Europe increased its economic capacity by leaps and bounds, while Africa appeared to have been almost static. Africa, in the late 19th century, could still be described as part communal and part feudal, although Western Europe had moved completely from feudalism to capitalism. To elucidate the main thesis of this study, it is necessary to follow not only the development of Europe and the underdevelopment of Africa, but also to understand how those two combined in a single system, that of capitalism, capitalist imperialism. So Baba Rodney is telling us capitalist imperialism, for those of you who want to be African and support capitalism and claim that you are in the liberation movement, just to let you know, the development of Europe is the underdevelopment of Africa, as it is currently under the capitalist imperialist system. That's the colonial system. It used to be the colonial system. Currently, it's the capitalist imperialism system. As long as we have that system existing, then you will always have the development of Europe, the West, including the US, and the underdevelopment of Africa, because it takes draining Africa to develop Europe, the way that the terms of engagement are currently. The European economy was producing far more goods by making use of their own resources and labor, as well as the resources and labor of the rest of the world. There were many qualitative changes in the European economy, which accompanied and made possible the increase in the quantity of goods. For example, machines and factories rather than land provided the main source of wealth, and labor had long since ceased to be organized on a restricted family basis. The peasantry had been brutally destroyed, and the labor of men, women, and children was ruthlessly exploited, still is ruthlessly exploited. Those were the great social evils of the capitalist system, which must not be forgotten. But on the issue of comparative economics, the relevant fact is that what was a slight difference when the Portuguese sailed to West Africa in 1444 was a huge gap by the time that European robber statesmen sat down in Berlin 440 years later to decide who should steal which parts of Africa. It was that gap which provided both the necessity and the opportunity for Europe to move into the imperialist epoch and to colonize and further underdevelop Africa. The growing technological and economic gap between Western Europe and Africa was part of the trend within capitalism to concentrate or polarize wealth and poverty at two opposite extremes. Inside Western Europe itself, some nations grew rich at the expense of others. Britain, France, and Germany were the most prosperous nations. Poverty prevailed in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and southern Italy. Inside the British, French, and German economies, the polarization of wealth was between the capitalists on the one hand and the workers and a few peasants on the other. The big capitalists got bigger and the little ones were eliminated. I would add, were exploited, right? Eliminated, but also exploited. In many important fields such as iron and steel manufacture, textiles, and particularly banking, it was noticeable that 2 or 3 firms monopolized most of the business. The banks were also in a commanding position within the economy as a whole, providing capital to the big monopoly industrial firms. European monopoly firms operated by constantly fighting to gain control over raw materials, markets, and means of communications. They also fought to be the first to invest in new profitable undertakings related to their line of business, whether it be inside or outside their countries. Indeed, after the scope for expansion became limited inside their national economies, their main attention was turned to those countries whose economics were less developed and who would therefore offer little or no opposition to the penetration of foreign capitalism. That penetration of foreign capitalism on a worldwide scale from the late 19th century onwards is what we call imperialism. I will read that sentence one more time. That penetration of foreign capitalism on a worldwide scale from the late 19th century onwards is what we call imperialism. Imperialism meant capitalist expansion. It meant that European and Northern American and Japanese capitalists were forced by the internal logic of their competitive system to seek abroad in less developed countries opportunities to control raw material supplies, to find markets, and to find profitable fields of investment. The centuries of trade with Africa contributed greatly to that state of affairs, where European capitalists were faced with the necessity to expand in a big way outside their national economies. There were certain areas in Africa in which European investment was meant to get immediate super profits. The mines of South Africa, the loans to North African governments, remember that, the loans, they call it aid. And the building of the Suez Canal also ensured the greater profitability of European investment in and trade with India. However, Africa's greatest value to Europe at the beginning of the imperialist era was as a source of raw materials such as palm products, groundnuts, cotton, and rubber. The need for those materials arose out of Europe's expanded economic capacity, its new and larger machines, and its increasing wage-earning population in towns. All of those things had developed over the previous 4 centuries, and again, it needs to be repeated that one of the important factors in that process was the unequal trade with Africa. Imperialism is essentially an economic phenomenon, and it does not necessarily lead to direct political control or colonization. However, Africa was the victim of colonization. In the period of the notorious Scramble for Africa, Europeans made a grab for whatever they thought spelled profits in Africa, and they even consciously acquired many areas not for immediate exploitation, but with an eye to the future. Each European nation that had, I'm going to pause there real quick. We were talking yesterday on our show on Kumbukeni about the 2063 agenda, right? The Africa we want is what they're calling it. And I mentioned, and I will mention right now, who is the we that wants that Africa in 2063? We as Africans have to be very, very aware and confront that question. Who is the we in this statement, the Africa we want 2063? Because Baba Rodney is telling us, in the period of notorious scramble for Africa, Europeans made a grab for whatever they thought spelled profits in Africa. And they even consciously acquired many areas not for immediate exploitation, but with an eye to the future, 2063. Each European nation that had these short-term and long-term economic interests ran up its own flag in different parts of Africa and established colonial rule. The gap that had arisen during the period of pre-colonial trade gave Europe the power to impose political domination on Africa. Pre-colonial trade in slaves, ivory, gold, and other things was conducted from the coasts of Africa. On the coasts, European ships could dominate the scene, and if necessary, forts could be built. Before the 19th century, Europe was incapable of penetrating the African continent because the balance of force at their disposal was inadequate. But the same technological changes which created the need to penetrate Africa also created the power to conquer Africa. The firearms of the imperialist epoch marked a qualitative leap forward. Breech-loading rifles and machine guns were a far cry from the smooth-bored muzzle loaders and flintlocks of the previous era. European imperialists in Africa boasted that what counted was the fact that they had the Maxim machine gun and Africans did not. And you all know what the Maxim, well, you may not all know what the Maxim machine gun did, but that was the defining moment as far as Africans not being able to fight back. With the Maxim gun, I forget now how many bullets it fires. It's just many bullets constantly firing, just wiping out whoever is in front of it. So you can imagine that if Shaka Zulu and his warriors are fighting with a short spear and are running towards the enemy, and there's a Maxim gun, it's spraying them all on the ground, never to be seen again in physical form on this earth. So that was made a huge difference as far as the Europeans overcoming Africa. Curiously, Europeans often derived the moral, and I'll put the spelling, the gun there. Those of you who want to look into that and find out exactly what it did and how it made a difference as far as the conquering of Africa. Gave them an unfair advantage. Curiously, Europeans often derived the moral justification for imperialism and colonialism from features of the international trade as conducted up to the eve of colonial rule in Africa. The British were the chief spokesmen for the view that the desire to colonize was largely based on their good intentions and wanting to put put a stop to the slave trade. That is an error there. Yeah, so the British are pretending like we don't know the Americans come from the British. Like we don't know the Americans are descendants of the British, right? At that time. Like we don't know that. So the British come and pretend that apparently, oh, they are opposed to slave trading. True enough, the British in the 19th century were as opposed to slave trading as they were once in favor of it. Many changes inside Britain had transformed the 17th century necessity for slaves into the 19th century necessity to clear the remnants of slaving from Africa so as to organize the local exploitation of land and labor. Wait again. Was it moral that they decided to stop enslaving Africans? No, 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 no. It wasn't. It was in order for them to organize the local exploitation of land and labor. Remember, the Brits are still on the ground in Africa. Now it's colonialism. They are claiming that's their land and it no longer belongs to Africans. Therefore, slaving was rejected insofar as it had become a fetter on further capitalist development. This was particularly true of East Africa, where Arab slaving persisted until late in the 19th century. For those Africans who want to believe that the white man decided to stop enslaving you because he was kind, he had finally found a moral ground to stand on, no. The white man wanted to figure out a better way to make money out of you that you are not going to resist. The British took special self-righteous delight in putting an end to Arab slave trading and in deposing rulers on the grounds that they were slave traders. Who were slave traders? It's another error there. However, in those very years, the British were crushing political leaders in Nigeria like Jaja and Nana, who had by then seized the export of slaves and were concentrating instead on products like palm oil and rubber. Similarly, the Germans in East Africa made a pretense of being most opposed to rulers like Bushiri, who were engaged in slave trading, but the Germans were equally hostile to African rulers with little interest in slaving. We see this trend in the Western culture. It still happens to this day. They will do something that will result in some dysfunction in society. Then they'll sit back and be like, oh, there's a dysfunction in society. We reject that. Let's figure out a way to fix this. So they cause the problem, they turn around, point fingers, and then they say they want to help. The common factor underlying the overthrow of African rulers in East, West, Central, North, and South Africa was that they stood in the way of Europe's imperial needs. It was the only factor that mattered, with anti-slaving sentiments being at best superfluous and at worst calculated hypocrisy. That's exactly what it was. King Leopold II of Belgium also used the anti-slavery excuse to introduce into Congo forced labor and modern slavery. Besides, all Europeans had derived ideas of racial and cultural superiority between the 15th and 19th centuries while engaged in genocide and the enslavement of non-white peoples. Even Portugal, an impoverished and backward European nation in the imperialist era, could still presume that it had a destiny to civilize the natives in Africa. Imagine that, the caucasity of it all. There is a curious interpretation of the Scramble and African Partition, which virtually amounts to saying that colonialism came about because of Africa's needs rather than those of Europe. To any African who speaks to some white man or woman telling you, or some African who has been infested by the false notion of white superiority, that tells you that the Europeans came to Africa to benefit us, to meet our needs, just look at them and walk away. The ancestors can deal with them. Africa, they say, required European colonization if it were to advance beyond the stage it had reached in the late 19th century. Clearly, they do not appreciate that such a line of reasoning was suggesting that Africa would develop if it were given bigger doses of the European concoction that had already started its underdevelopment, that it would develop if it lost the last remnants of its freedom of choice, which had clearly been seriously undermined by the pre-colonial trade, that it would develop if its economy became more integrated with Europe's own terms that were entirely dictated by Europe. For those of you who invite Europeans in those rooms in Africa to tell you what to do, those implications and their fallacies would be plain. And I'm gonna say this quickly, because I come off sometimes as being very judgmental, right? And rebuking Africans who are accommodating the false notion of white supremacy. Here's the thing. If you have watched Kumbukeni and you continue to accommodate the false notion of white supremacy, you are to blame now. And I am going to judge you 100% with no regret. And I am going to rebuke you. If you are an African who has still not heard the word, who has still not gone through the process of decolonizing your mind, I will have grace for you. And then I will introduce you to this book. And then I will send you the link to the readings on Kumbukeni. And if you refuse to watch them, then I will blame you as well. Those implications and their fallacies would be plain to anyone who tries to understand the development process before making pronouncements on any particular epoch of human development in Africa. Throughout the 14th century, African rulers were displaying great initiative in pursuit of the broadest forms of cultural contact with Europe. In the case of West Africa, that meant seeking substitutes for trade in slaves. Dahomey, once one of the most embroiled in slave trading, was among those states that used many of the last years of its independence to find healthy basis for cultural exchange with Europeans. There's no healthy basis for cultural exchange with Europeans. In 1850, the reigning, as long as they're the ones controlling that mode of exchange, there's no healthy basis for cultural exchange with Europeans. None. If you want a healthy basis for exchange, cultural, economical, political, with Europeans, you have to be controlling the terms of exchange. You have to embrace kujichagulia, the principle of deciding for yourself and not being told what to do. In 1850, the reigning Dahomean king, Gezo, proclaimed an edict whereby all young oil palms were to be freed from parasites surrounding them, and severe penalties were to be imposed for cutting palm trees. Gezo, who ruled from... Hold on real quick. Just bear with me. In 1850, the reigning Dahomean king, Gezo, proclaimed an edict whereby all young oil palms were to be freed from parasites surrounding them, and severe penalties were to be imposed for cutting palm trees. Gezo, who ruled from 1818 to 1857, was a reformer, and he made sincere efforts to meet criticisms of his policies by groups such as missionaries and anti-slavery campaigners. But it soon became clear that Europeans were not bent on seeing Dahomey re-emerge as a strong state, but were rather creating excuses and the subjective conditions to justify their proposed colonization of the people of Dahomey. Under those circumstances, the last Dahomean monarch, Glele, fell back on his capital at Abomey and pursued the policies which he considered most consistent with the dignity and independence of Dahomey. Glele raided Abekuta, which contained converts who were already British protected persons. He told the French to get the hell out of Porto Novo, and he generally resisted until defeated militarily by the French in 1889. African groups who had little or nothing to do with slave exports also intensified their efforts to integrate into a wider world in the 19th century. Gugun Hana, the Nguni ruler of Gaza in Mozambique, asked for a Swiss missionary doctor and maintained him at his court for several years until the Portuguese conquered his kingdom in 1895. After the Portuguese imposed colonial rule, it was a long time before Africans saw another doctor. It is particularly instructive to turn to the example of Egypt under Muhammad Ali, who ruled from 1805 to 1849. Capitalist Europe had left feudal North Africa behind over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. Muhammad Ali was aware of that and consciously aimed at catching up with Europe. He instituted a series of reforms, the most important of which were of an economic nature. Egypt grew and manufactured its own cotton, and it made glass, paper, and other industrial goods. Egypt was not to be used as a dumping ground for European goods, which would undermine local industry to that protective tariff so that protective tariff walls were set up around Egypt's infant industries. There's a solution there for Africans in that statement. Stop bringing European goods to undermine local industry, right? That did not mean that Egypt became isolated from the rest of the world. On the contrary, that's the argument that people usually tell you when we say Africa wants to be independent of the West. We want to kick out the Western companies, and they tell you, so how is Africa supposed to survive alone, right? This ruler in Egypt making this decision to stop bringing European goods into Egypt that undermine the local industry did not mean that Egypt became isolated from the rest of the world. On the contrary, Muhammad Ali borrowed experts from Europe and he increased Egypt's foreign trade. The ideals of Muhammad Ali could be related in the idiom of modern social science as being the creation of a viable, self-propelling economy to provide the basis for national independence. Such ideals were diametrically opposed to the needs of European capitalism, because you put Africa first. British and French industrialists wanted to see Egypt not as a textile manufacturer, but as a producer of raw cotton for export and an importer of European manufactures, which is what is currently happening in Africa, right? European financiers wanted Egypt to be a source of investment. And in the second half of the 18th century, those of you, I'm sorry. Every time I'm reading a sentence, it's just reminding me of what's going on currently in Africa. The West is talking about, oh, invest in Africa. That's not a good thing for Africa. Finally, European financiers wanted Egypt to be a source of investment. And in the second half of the 18th century, they turned the Sultan of Egypt into an international beggar who mortgaged the whole of Egypt to international monopoly financiers. This is exactly what is happening in Africa right now. Finally, European statesmen wanted Egyptian soil to serve as a base for exploiting India and Arabia. Therefore, the Suez Canal was dug out of Egyptian soil by Egyptians, but it was owned by Britain and France, who then extended political domination over Egypt and Sudan. Education is undeniably one of the facets of European life, which had grown most appreciably during the capitalist epoch. Through education, or miseducation, my addition, an extensive use of the written word, Europeans were in a position to pass on to the others the scientific principles of the material world which they had discovered, as well as a body of varied philosophical reflections on man and society. Africans were quick to appreciate advantages deriving from a literate education. In Madagascar, the Merina Kingdom did a great deal to sponsor reading and writing. They used their own language and an Arabic script, and they welcomed the aid of European missionaries. Little did they know, right? That conscious borrowing from all relevant sources was only possible when they had the freedom to choose. Colonization, far from springing from Malagasy needs, actually erected a barrier to the attainment of the modernization initiated by the Merino kings in the 1860s and 1870s. A similar example can be found in the history of Tunisia before the Acts of Partition fell. In many parts of the world, capitalism in its imperialist form accepted that some measure of political sovereignty should be left in the hands of the local population. This was so in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and to a more limited extent in China. However, European capitalists came to the decision that Africa should be directly colonized. There is evidence to suggest that such a course of action was not entirely planned. Britain and France, up to the 1850s and 1860s, would have preferred to divide Africa into informal spheres of influence. That means that there would have been a gentleman's agreement that, say, Nigeria would be exploited by the British merchants while Senegal would be exploited by Frenchmen. At the same time, both Englishmen and Frenchmen would trade in a minor way in each other's informal empire. But, firstly, there was disagreement over who should sack which pieces of Africa, especially since Germany wanted to join the grabbing. And secondly, The moment that one European power declared an area of Africa as a protectorate or a colony, it put up tariffs against European traders of other nationalities. You've heard that with the French, right? The French gets apparently in the spaces where they occupy, they get fast dibs on everything. And in turn, forced their rivals to have colonies and discriminatory tariffs. One thing led to another, and soon 6 European capitalist nations were falling over each other to establish direct political rule over particular sections of Africa. Make no mistake about it, gentlemen like Karl Peters, Livingstone, Stanley, Harry Johnson, de Brazza, General Gordon, and their masters in Europe were literally scrambling for Africa. They barely avoided a major military conflagration. In addition to the factors that caused the chain reaction of the scramble as described above, Europeans were also racially motivated to seek political domination over Africa. The 19th century was one in which white racism was most violently and openly expressed in capitalist societies, with the United States as a focal point and with Britain taking the lead among the Western European capitalist nations. Britain accepted granting domination status to its old colonies of white settlers in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but it withdrew self-government from the West Indies when the white planters were ousted from the legislative assemblies by black or brown people. As far as Africa, Jamaica, talking about you're still ruled by Britain. Like seriously, Jamaica, for real. As far as Africa is concerned, Englishmen violently opposed black self-government such as the Fante Confederation on the Gold Coast in the 1860s. They also tried to erode the authority of black Creoles in Sierra Leone. In 1874, when Fora Bay College sought and obtained affiliation with Durham University, the Times newspaper declared that Durham should next affiliate with the London Zoo. Pervasive and vicious racism was present in imperialism as a variant independent of the economic rationality that initially gave birth to racism. It was economics that determined that Europe should invest in Africa and control the continent's raw materials and labor. It was racism which confirmed the decision that the form of control should be direct colonial rule. Africans everywhere fought against alien political rule and had to be subdued by superior force. But a sizable minority did insist that their trade connections with Europe should remain unbroken, for that was a measure of the extent to which they were already dependent on Europe. You still have those black people, African people. The most dramatic illustration of that dependence was the determination with which some Africans fought the end of the European slave trade. For most European capitalist states, the enslavement of Africans had served its purpose by the middle of the 19th century. But for those Africans who dealt in captives, the abrupt termination of the trade at any given point was a crisis of the greatest magnitude. In many areas, major social changes had taken place to bring the particular regions effectively into the service of the European slave trade, one of the most significant being the rise of domestic slavery and various forms of class and caste subjugation. If we're going to liberate Africa, that whole notion of enslaving some for the service of a few needs to stop. African rulers and traders who found their social existence threatened by the earliest legal edicts, such as the 1807 British Act against the trade in slaves, found ways of making contact with Europeans who still wanted slaves. In sub-Saharan Africa and especially in West Africa, the export of slaves declined most rapidly where Europeans were prepared to buy other commodities. As soon as inhabitants of any region found that they had a product with Europeans were accepting, in place of the former slave trade, those inhabitants put tremendous effort in organizing the alternatives, namely ivory, rubber, palm products, groundnuts. Once more, those efforts demonstrated the determination of a small but decisive proportion of Africans. It was a determination based on the desire to obtain European trade goods, many of which had ceased to be mere curiosities or luxuries and were regarded instead as necessities. I wonder what that would be. The first 4 centuries, people probably consider vehicles and stuff. The first 4 centuries of Afro-European trade in a very real sense represent the roots of African underdevelopment. Colonialism flourished rapidly from a European viewpoint because several of its features were already rooted in Africa in the preceding period. One of the most decisive features of the colonial system was the presence of Africans serving as economic, political, and cultural agents of the European colonialists. Those agents or compradors were already serving European interests in the pre-colonial period. The impact of trade with Europe had reduced many African rulers to the status of middlemen for European trade. It had raised ordinary Africans to that same middleman commercial role, and it had created a new trading group of mixed blood, the children of Europe and Arab fathers. Those types can all be referred to as compradors, and they played a key role in extending European activity from the coast into the hinterland as soon as Europeans thought of taking over political power. One outstanding example of the above is the way that the French colonialists used Africans and mulattoes on the Senegalese coast as agents for the spread of French control for thousands of miles into areas now covered by Senegal, Mali, Chad, Upper Volta, and Niger. Those particular blacks and mulattoes were living in the trading ports of Gori, Dakar, St. Louis, and Rufisque. And they had had long-standing links with Atlantic trade. Africans conducting trade on behalf of, hold on real quick. Sorry, just bear with me. Okay. Sorry about that. Just making sure I'm in the right place. All right. Okay. Africans conducting trade on behalf of Europeans were not merely commercial agents, but also cultural agents, since inevitably they were heavily influenced by European thought and values. The search for European education. So, cultural agents as far as detaching Africans from their culture. The search for European education began in Africa before the colonial period. Coastal rulers and traders recognized the necessity to penetrate more deeply into the way of life of the white man who came across the sea. The mulatto sons of white traders and the sons of African rulers were the ones who made the greatest effort to learn the white man's ways. This helped them to conduct business more efficiently. One Sierra Leone ruler in the 18th century explained that he wished, open quote, to learn book to be rogue as good as white man, end quote. And there were many others who saw the practical advantages of literacy. However, the educational process also meant imbibing values, which led to further African subjugation. One West African educated in this early period wrote a PhD thesis in Latin justifying slavery. Hold on 1 minute. Let's all just sit with that. Baba Rodney says, however, the educational process also meant imbibing values which led to further African subjugation. So much so that one African from West Africa wrote a PhD thesis in Latin justifying slavery, an African justifying the enslavement of him and his people, because he's been so colonized mentally that he sees the logic in that. That was not surprising. The Reverend Thomas Thompson was the first European educator in the Gold Coast, and he wrote in 1778 a pamphlet entitled The African Trade for Negro Slaves Shown to be Consistent with the Principles of Humanity and the Laws of Revealed Religion. One of the most striking features of 19th century West African history is the manner in which Africans returned from slavery under European masters and helped in the establishment of colonial rule. This was especially true of Africans who returned from the West Indies and North America to Sierra Leone, or who were released from slave ships and landed in Sierra Leone. To a lesser extent, I'm going to say this real quick, right? Because I am currently living in the US, and my decolonization, mental decolonization process started when it hit a point and things just didn't make sense, right? We're talking about Africans returning from slavery under European masters and then helping in the establishment of colonial rule. For me, I would stop and ask, say what now? No, that doesn't make sense. You want me to do what? Against me and my people? That's when you have to start awakening. You cannot go along with, like, I don't. All right, we need to continue the process of decolonizing our minds. This was especially true of Africans who returned from the West Indies and North America to Sierra Leone, or who were released from slave ships and landed in Sierra Leone. To a lesser extent, it also applied to Africans who were once in Brazil. Such individuals had assimilated capitalist values and, like most European missionaries, promoted the kinds of activity that went along with colonial rule. I am an African who once upon a time said, oh, let's get clothes from the US. Oh, they're so much better. Oh, I want to speak English. I want to speak proper English. But it comes a point where once you encounter these people and you hear what they're saying and you see what laws, I mean, as you become an adult, as you have more awareness, as your brain develops and you're better able to question, to critically analyze what's happening in front of you, right? As a child, you follow. You're raised to follow and listen and pay and be obedient. But as an adult, as you become an adult, you get in your teenage years, you get in your young adulthood, in your adulthood, you start to look at things around you and analyze. At least that's how I was, and ask questions, which got me in a lot of trouble. But I'm glad for it, because that's what starts you to decolonize your mind for Africans, because we are all currently colonized mentally. And when you're told to do something like, for example, come back and put together a colonial rule against your people, for example, African leaders now, who you sit with the IMF and the IMF says to you, oh, by the way, you're going to stop providing subsidies for your farmers. You cannot help your farmers and support them to build business. I'll be like, say what now? Like, you all need to say that. Say what now? My country. Stop the farmers from growing food. How are we going to eat? Like, that's the question that we Africans need to start asking. The white man comes to you and says, oh, by the way, you got to sell percentage of Kenya Airways. You've all got to ask, how is that going to benefit us Africans when they say that? What are we getting in return? This is the one time to be selfish. When the white man is sitting at the table, this is the one time Africans are allowed to be selfish. Ask them, okay, I hear you. What are we getting in return? What is Africa getting in return? Tell us that deal. And open your eyes as they give you that answer, so that you can see the untruths in it, the disingenuous nature of it, so that you can call it out, break it down. Oh, okay. And how is that going to happen? All right. Okay. Then you do that, and then we'll sign the paper. Like, just for real, we have to all start questioning. This was especially true of Africans who returned from the West Indies and North America to Sierra Leone, or who were released from slave ships and landed in Sierra Leone. I will say my energy is a little bit confrontational, just because of everything happening right now, and just because of all the justification of everything happening online. So, yeah, that's why yeah. To a lesser extent, it also applied to Africans who were once in Brazil. Such individuals had assimilated capitalist values and, like most European missionaries, promoted the kinds of activity that went along with colonial rule. In a rather different context, it can be argued that the Arabs of Zanzibar and the East African coast were also transformed into agents of European colonialism. At first, they resisted because European colonialism affected their own expansionist ambitions on the East African mainland. They didn't resist because they cared about you, Africans. But they soon came to an arrangement which gave Europeans the ultimate powers. The Europeans reduced the small Arab clique into political and economic instruments of imperialism. It's hard. It's hard to read Walter Rodney as you see the truth, not because of how he writes or what he writes, but because it's showing you the truth in our contemporary times, in what's happening today. It shows you the truth in the system that has us still shackled as Africans. And it shows you the truth in how Africans are going along with it without questioning it, despite the fact that it is harming fellow Africans. And they're seeing this only because they're looking out for me, for number one. And it's aggravating when you see that. It really is. It's aggravating when you hear that Christianity and Islam was used to marginalize us, and you're not able to come out and speak to Africans about it because Africans are in their feelings about religion. European superiority over the Arabs in East and North Africa and the Middle East demonstrates conclusively that modern imperialism is inseparable from capitalism and underlines the role of slavery in the context of capitalism. The Arabs had acquired Africans as slaves for centuries, but they were exploited in a feudal context. African slaves in Arab hands became domestic soldiers and agricultural serfs. Whatever surplus they produced was not for reinvestment and multiplication of capital, as in the West Indian or North American slave systems, but for consumption by the feudal elite. Indeed, slaves were often maintained more for social prestige than for economic benefit. The major exceptions to that rule were 19th century Zanzibar and Egypt under Muhammad Ali. In both those instances, African labor was being exploited to produce profit on a plantation basis, and this may also have applied to date plum production in Arabia. So even Muhammad Ali, that was mentioned a few pages before, was exploiting Africans. But Europe had already been exploiting African labor to maximize surplus for 3 centuries previously. And the contribution which the plantation system made to the European capitalist development was so great that Western Europe in the 19th century had engulfed the lesser exploitation of Zanzibar and Arabia, and it secured a firm grasp on Egypt's economy after the death of Muhammad Ali in 1849. In other words, the cloves, cotton, and dates produced in Zanzibar, Egypt, and Arabia, respectively, previous to colonization, were already going to strengthen European trade and production. Eventually, it was no problem for the capitalist slave traders of Europe to extend political domination over the feudalist Arab slave traders and to use the latter as agents of colonialism in East Africa. Returning to the question of indigenous African, and to this day, by the way, to this day, Arabs and Indians in Africa treat Africans in East Africa, treat them poorly to this day. The way they speak to them, I remember as a child, when we went on vacation and we encountered Indian families. And I remember us ganging up to fight back the treatment that the Indian kids were giving to us. I remember us doing that. And even as an adult, as I think about it, I'm like, good for you, Nduku. Because they deserve it. You cannot come to Africa and start treating Africans and talking to them disrespectfully and thinking that you're going to be treated with grace. No. Eventually, it was no problem for the capitalist slave traders of Europe to extend political domination over the feudalist Arab slave traders and to use the latter as agents of colonialism in East Africa. Returning to the question of indigenous African agents of European colonial rule in Africa, it should be recognized that Europeans recruited Africans to serve in the armies that actually conquered Africa in the bloody period from the 1880s through the First World War, started by Europeans in 1914. It is a widespread characteristic of colonialism to find agents of repression from among the colonial victims themselves. Yet, without the previous centuries of trade between Africa and Europe, it would have been impossible for Europeans to have so easily recruited the Askaris, Porters, and others who made their colonial conquest possible. How do they do this? I have been victim of this. They tell you, oh, now you're one of us. You're a citizen. You're a United States citizen. All right, you're working for the federal government. This is a mission to protect all United States citizens. You're a United citizen, right? So you work for them and you're like, good, we're protecting us. This is good. They are not doing anything wrong. We're protecting us. So this is how let's talk about on the continent, right? You are a partner to the United States. Kenya is one of these good partners. Oh, we're going to work with you to support the interests of the United States because you're a partner. Because you're a partner, you feel like your interests are part of this negotiation. It's benefiting you to help them because you're a partner. African residents of the Senegalese port already referred to were the ones who were put in French army uniform and fought to establish French rule in the interior and other parts of the coast, such as Dahomey. When the British defeated Asante in 1874, they hired in their forces African troops from the coastal towns around the Gold Coast forts. Those Africans had been in contact with Europeans for so long that from the 17th century, they identified themselves as Dutch, Danish, or English, depending upon whose fort gave them employment. They had fought battles for one European nation against another, and by the late 19th century, it was an easy matter to get them to fight against fellow Africans on behalf of the conquering colonial power of Britain. Oh my goodness. I'm sorry, my brothers and sisters in the US. Please don't come for me. But this is reminding me of how you're all ready, not all of you, a lot of you are ready to defend your Americanness before your Africanness, right? I am American. I'm not African. In the Portuguese territories, the origins of the Black colonial police and army also went back into the pre-colonial trade period. I say these things not to hurt you, but to piss you off enough to start questioning what the hell, and then for you to awaken from that anger. Please. Not coming for me. Don't come for me. Deal with you. Around the forts of Luanda and Benguela in Angola and Lourenço, Maqui, and Beira in Mozambique, there grew up communities of Africans, mulattoes, and even Indians who helped pacify large areas for the Portuguese after the Berlin Conference. If you want to call yourself an American as an African, ask yourself what America has done for you and your people, not you as an individual. I want to call myself an American. What has America done for me and my people? Traders in Mozambique and in the rest of East, West, and Central Africa who had experience with Europeans previous to colonialism, and please do not tell me like, I'm talking about significant things that they've done for you. We have an issue in the US of police violence. What has America done to stop that? We have an issue in the US of guns in the community, Black community. What has America done to stop that? Right? We have poverty in the Black communities. What is America doing to stop that? What is America investing in those communities to help you Black people? No, not the white people who are going to move in, but we Black people in America to help us get out of poverty so that we can call ourselves American and stand in pride in Americanness because of what we can show you what they're doing for us and our community, the collective community, not the Beyoncés, the Tyler Perrys, and the celebrity Black people, the exceptions, the one Black person sitting in the conference room feeling so achieved. Instead of asking, hey, we have many Black people in this office. Why am I the only one in the room? So next time you want to call yourself American, back it up with, this is what America has done for Black people, and stand in it. Traders in Mozambique and in the rest of East, West, and Central Africa who had experience with Europe. And by the way, do not limit yourself. Do not limit yourself to the borders of America when you question the United States and what it's done for Black people. Take yourself beyond those borders. See what they're doing to Black people beyond those borders before you call yourself an American. Traders in Mozambique and in the rest of East, West. I cannot help myself, I'm sorry. Because as I continue to read, the clarity comes. The point is not for you to be anti-American. That's not the argument, although there's an argument to be made there. The point is for you to look beyond paperwork, to look beyond passports, to look beyond titles, to look beyond flags, and actually look at how people are living day to day. Actually look at how you are living day to day, and not just you, the African, the majority, the collective, is living day to day. What this entity that you're choosing to affiliate with is doing globally. And that's part of the decolonization process. You have to sit once you start learning the truth. And as you're learning the truth, you're seeing that entity that you're affiliated with showing up as one of the criminals who's underdeveloping Africa. You have to start asking yourself, what's my role in this? I cannot claim to be an African who's fighting for liberation if I continue my role in this. How do I stop my role in this? How do I start transitioning out of this so that I can fight and defend and advocate for Africa and Africans as a collective? Traders in Mozambique and in the west of East and in the rest of East, West, and Central Africa who had experience with Europeans previous to colonialism were the ones to provide porters to carry the heavy machine guns. So the Maxim gun was carried by Black people. Cannons. I mean, I get it. A lot of them probably did it under threat. And the support equipment. They were the ones who provided the would-be European colonialists with the information and military intelligence that facilitated conquest. And they were the interpreters who were the voice of the Europeans on African soil. As someone who is now confronting my role in this, that is something for all of us to ask ourselves. I'm going to read that part. As someone who is checking myself in my role in this and getting myself out of it. And for the Africans, I know the many of you who are in those spaces doing just this, thinking you're helping, because they've made you believe that you're a part of them. Traders in Mozambique and in the rest of East, West, and Central Africa who had experience with Europeans previous to colonialism were the ones to provide porters to carry the heavy machine guns, cannons, and the support equipment. They were the ones who provided the would-be European colonialists with the information and military intelligence that facilitated conquest. And they were the interpreters who were the voice of the Europeans on African soil. Of course, it is true that many Africans who had little or nothing to do, hold on real quick, another typo, who had little or nothing to do with pre-colonial trade also allied themselves with European newcomers. In that respect, the gap in levels of political organization between Europe and Africa was very crucial. I'm going to just stop there real quick and go back one more paragraph, just where I was reading about providing information and military intelligence. For those of you who see me here and think that I am judging you, I had to ask myself, because I was in a role like that one, right? And I had to ask myself, dude, I had to tell myself, you're part of the problem. As I started reading and learning the history, right? And reading this book, I have several books I've read and I could see me being talked to. Walter Rodney talking to me, telling me I'm part of the problem. And I had to stop and say, okay, I need to stop this. I need to stop being part of the problem. Because if I want Africa to develop, because they have underdeveloped, so if I want Africa to develop, I have to stop participating in the underdevelopment of Africa. I myself had to, the words that I say to you all, I had to say them to myself. The development of political unity in the form or large states was proceeding steadily in Africa. I'm assuming that's the former or large states were proceeding steadily in Africa. But even so, at the time of the Berlin Conference, Africa was still a continent of a large number of socio-political groupings who had not arrived at a common purpose. Therefore, it was easy for the European intruder to play the classic game of divide and conquer. What does that say to us Africans? We must find a common purpose. We must find a common purpose to stop this tactics of divide and conquer. We as Africans must, global Africans beyond the continent of Africa, must find a common purpose that will unite us and make us immune to these divide and conquer tactics. In that way, certain Africans became unwitting allies of Europe. And yes, that is how they get you. You get in thinking you're doing good. You're not aware. You're busy caught up in trying to survive. And you're not aware that you're joining the very enemy of your people. And you get in there. But when you get in there, when you start reading, which is why it is important. Adesoji has said this, Milton has said this on the show, Kumbukeni, for us to read. So if you're an African who's listening to this and you have access to books, open them and read books about history, not the ones written by white racist people, but books written by Black people who are confronting what is happening around them. Read them. Read so that you can start seeing yourself being criticized, so that you can start questioning yourself and confronting yourself. And in confronting yourself, confronting the system that you're a part of that is oppressing your people. Many African rulers sought a European alliance to deal with their own African neighbor with whom they were in conflict. I'm thinking ECOWAS right now. Few of those rulers appreciated the implication of their actions. They could not know that Europeans had come to stay permanently. They could not know that Europeans were out to conquer not some, but all Africans. For the African nations who want to feel like you're special, again, Kenya is a partner. Rwanda, look at how Rwanda is doing. They're partners. And then you unite with those Europeans against fellow Africans. For example, Rwanda against Congo. Thinking that you're going to be immune, you're protected from them coming for you. You best awaken, because the moment that you're the target or they feel like they can benefit from you and you're not cooperating, those African leaders who now I see online talking all kinds of making big, strong statements against imperialism, but are not acting. When they think that you're being too brave as an African, they will come for you. You working with them to subjugate another African nation is not going to protect you from them coming for you when they're done with you. They could not know that Europeans had come to stay permanently. They could not know that Europeans were out to conquer not some, but all Africans. This partial and inadequate view of the world was itself a testimony of African underdevelopment relative to Europe, which in the 19th century was self-confidently seeking dominion in every part of the globe. Political divisions in Africa were no evidence of innate inferiority or backwardness. That was the state in which the continent then found itself, a point along a long road that others had traversed and along which Africa was moving. Commercial impact of Europe slowed down the process of political amalgamation and expansion, in contrast to the way trade with Africa strengthened Europe's nation states. When European capitalism took the form of imperialism and started to subjugate Africa politically, the normal political conflicts of the pre-capitalist African situation was transformed into weakness, which allowed the Europeans to set up their colonial domination. I will repeat that line. When European capitalism took the form of imperialism and started to subjugate Africa politically, the normal political conflicts of the pre-capitalist African situation were transformed into weakness, which allowed the Europeans to set up their colonial domination. Altogether, it is very clear that to understand the coming of colonialism into Africa, one has to consider the previous historical evolution of both Africa and Europe, and in particular, one has to consider ways in which their trade contacts influenced the two continents mutually, so that what was called pre-colonial trade proved to be a preparatory stage for the era of colonial rule. It is widely accepted that Africa was colonized because of its weakness. The concept of weakness should be understood to embrace military weakness and inadequate economic capacity, as well as certain political weaknesses, namely the incompleteness of the establishment of nation states, which left the continent divided, and the low level of consciousness concerning the world at large, which had already been transformed into a single system by the expansion of capitalist relations. So we must learn about them. We are now moving on to chapter 5. Learning about them does not mean embracing their ways and their culture. Learning about them means knowing who they are, how they operate, so that you can prepare them for yourself for them when they come to work with you. You're not caught unawares. All right, chapter 5. Africa's contribution to the capitalist development of Europe, the colonial period. The colonies have been created for the metropole by the metropole. It's a French saying. The colonies, it's a French saying for those Africans who want to call themselves French. The colonies have been created for the metropole by the metropole. Sales operations in the United States and management of the 14 Unilever plants are directed from Lever House on New York's fashionable Park Avenue. You look at this tall, striking glass and steel structure, and you wonder how many hours of unpaid black labor and how many thousands of tons of underpriced palm oil and peanuts and cocoa it cost to build it. W. Alpheus Hunton. So the next time y'all are walking in the city, Chicago, New York, wherever you may be, and you see Deloitte or whatever other company, just stop and ask yourself, I wonder how many African resources went into building this building. I wonder how many African people did or are still being exploited to keep this business running. I wonder. Expatriation of Africa's surplus under colonialism, capital and African wage labor. Colonial Africa fell within that part of the international capitalist economy from which surplus was drawn to feed the metropolitan sector. As seen earlier, exploitation of land and labor is essential for human social advance, but only on the assumption that the product is made available within the area where the exploitation takes place. Colonialism was not merely a system of exploitation, but one whose essential purpose was to repatriate the profits to the so-called mother country. From an African viewpoint, that amounted to consistent expatriation. Oh God, that just reminded me, I'm sorry, of those Africans who called the Queen our mother, our Queen Mother. From an African viewpoint, that amounted to consistent expatriation of surplus produced by African labor out of African resources. It meant the development of Europe as part of this same dialectical process in which Africa was underdeveloped. Once you start decolonizing your mind, you cannot be a part of this nonsense because it doesn't make sense. By any standards, labor was cheap in Africa, and the amount of surplus extracted from the African laborer was great. The employer under colonialism paid an extremely small wage, a wage usually insufficient to keep the worker physically alive, and, therefore, he had to grow food to survive. And if you wanna challenge the notion that the West does not need us, like this is hypothetical. I know it's not gonna happen. I wish it could. For a week, I wish it could. I truly wish it could. I wish upon the divine, Ubuntu, and all our ancestors going back to forever. I wish they could influence it to happen. I wish they could zombify you all Africans, take over your brains and make it happen. If today Africans, wherever they may be, decide we're not working for this company for a week, we will all find out very quickly how reliant and dependent they are on us, our resources, including our bodies and our minds. Just a week. Maybe even a day, but I want a week. I want to relish in that moment. If Africans, wherever they may be, today, decide they're staying home or going to the beach or going to play, no, let's not play somewhere. No, let's not pay money for anything. Going for hiking, right? You're not paying money to anyone. Or if you decide you're just sitting at home on your steps, braiding your hair and braiding other people's hair, today, all of us, or I'm just going to sit home and drink porridge and eat some, whatever is in the fridge. I'm not going to go to the store. Today, we decide we're not contributing to this economy. Don't show up to work. Don't go to the grocery store. Don't go shopping. Don't go anywhere where you need to spend your money. You will understand on that day or that week how reliant the Western economy is on African bodies and resources. We're not going to do that. By any standards, labor was cheap in Africa and the amount of surplus extracted from the African laborer was great. The employer under colonialism paid an extremely small wage, a wage usually insufficient to keep the worker physically alive, and therefore he had to grow food to survive. I'll give you an example. New York State, today, New York State, you all know and listen, someone might think I'm crazy for saying this publicly, but if we're not confronting the system, we're not going to change the system. We're not going to change it if we're not confronting it. If we're not asking publicly to the majority of Africans, dudes, what the hell is this? Why is this happening? Does it make sense? New York State, unemployment today believes it is enough. Their maximum unemployment in New York State is $504 a week today. For those of you who live in New York, I don't know anywhere in New York where the rent is, what's 504 times 4? That is 80, that is $22,000. I don't know any decent space in New York right now that is $2,000. And by the way, that is just rent. You have other needs. So your check would just go to rent. That is what New York State today thinks is fair to pay people when they're unemployed. In this day and age where we're confronting racism, those are the risks Black people are facing. You will be fired when you're confronting racism. The chances of you losing a job today as a Black person are very high, especially if you're involved, truly involved, if you're genuinely involved in making change and questioning the system and being in these spaces where you're questioning how these companies are treating Black people, how the government is treating Black people, you are now at a higher risk of losing your job. So now you've lost your job in New York State. The maximum amount of unemployment is $504 a week. Talk about exploiting us. I mean, white people are being exploited in that process as well. But I'm concerned about Africans. $504 a week. And if you do something else on the side that is going to pay you, they will take out of that 504 because you got some. By any standards, colonialism was not merely a system of exploitation, but one whose essential purpose was to repatriate the profits to the so-called mother country. From an African viewpoint, that amounted to consistent expatriation of surplus produced by African labor out of African resources. It meant the development of Europe as part of the same dialectical process in which Africa was underdeveloped. By any standards, labor, I'm going to say this. That does not mean that we as Africans stop challenging the system because you don't want to be unemployed and you'll be paid $504 a week and you cannot survive on that. No, it means we start figuring out alternatives to support us, to support our needs. We as Africans start coming together to figure out alternatives so that we're not reliant on this system that thinks it's okay to pay us $504 when we lose our jobs. By any standards, labor was cheap in Africa, and the amount of surplus extracted from the African laborer was great. The employer under colonialism paid an extremely small wage, a wage usually insufficient to keep the worker physically alive, and therefore, he had to grow food to survive. And as I think of this, I will say this to all of you because it's a realization I'm coming to. I've read it too in books. Shame sometimes is healthy. Shame, right? Because I'm not trying to walk around New York seeing naked bodies. I'm just saying. Because that means that people are not ashamed to show their naked bodies, so they'll be walking around. I'd rather not see that. That's just me. Maybe I need to develop and continue decolonizing my mind. But shame, for example, me being ashamed to mention that New York unemployment is maximum 504. Oh, people, what are people going to think of me? Which stops me from exposing New York State for such a criminal act of thinking it's okay to pay people 504 a week and get away with it. So let's not let shame keep us from revealing the criminal aspects of the system that continue to subjugate us because you're worried what people will think of you. What will people think of me? No. You being unemployed is not a fault of yours if you're confronting racism in a system. Because the alternative is you not confronting it and it continuing for decades and for generations to come. And if you who thinks you're cool now, you have your house, you have your cars, let's say, for example, you're no longer on this earth and you left children and they don't have the same benefits that you had, they're going to fall victim to that system that you chose not to participate in eradicating because you only thought of yourself in that moment instead of looking at the bigger picture. By any standards, labor was cheap in Africa and in the amount of surplus extracted from the African laborer was great. The employer under colonialism paid an extremely small wage, a wage usually insufficient to keep the worker physically alive, and, therefore, he had to grow food to survive. This applied in particular to farm labor of the plantation type, to work in mines, and to certain forms of urban employment. At the time of the imposition of European colonial rule, Africans were able to gain a livelihood from the land. Many retained some contact with the land in the years ahead, and they worked away from their shambas in order to pay taxes or because they were forced to do so. After feudalism in Europe had ended, the worker had absolutely no means of sustenance other than through the sale of his labor to capitalists. We must get an alternative. Therefore, to some extent, the employer was responsible for ensuring the physical survival of the worker by giving him a living wage. We must get an alternative, Africans. In Africa, this was not the case. Europeans offered the lowest possible wages and relied on legislation backed by force to do the rest. There were several reasons why the African worker was more crudely exploited than his European counterpart in the present century. Firstly, the alien colonial state had a monopoly of political power after crushing all opposition by superior armed force. Secondly, the African working class was small, very dispersed, and very unstable owing to migratory practices. Thirdly, while capitalism was willing to exploit all workers everywhere, European capitalists in Africa had additional racial justifications for dealing unjustly with the African worker. The racist theory that the black man was inferior led to the conclusion that he deserved lower wages. And interestingly enough, the light-skinned Arab and Berber populations of North Africa were treated as blacks by the white racist French. The combination of the above factors in turn made it extremely difficult for African workers to organize themselves. This is a good one. Because when I started speaking about the racism in the organization I was working with, all the black people treated me like I had the plague. The combination of the above factors in turn made it extremely difficult for African workers to organize themselves. It is only the organization and resoluteness of the working class which protects it from the natural tendency of the capitalist to exploit, to the utmost. For those Africans who don't want to confront the system and think it's going to change because you're playing along, you're being the good Black person, the good African, it is only the organization and resoluteness of the working class which protects it from the natural tendency of the capitalist to exploit to the utmost. That is why in all colonial territories, when African workers realized the necessity for trade union solidarity, numerous obstacles were placed in their paths by the colonial regimes. Unions are essential for capitalism not to exploit you. Essential. If you can belong to one, do belong to one. Wages paid to workers in Europe, if you can start one, start one. Wages paid to workers in Europe and North America were much higher than wages paid to African workers in comparable categories. The Nigerian coal miner at Nduku earned 1 shilling per day for working underground and 9 pence per day for jobs on the surface. Such a miserable wage would be beyond the comprehension of a Scottish or German coal miner, who could virtually earn in an hour what the Nduku miner was paid for a 6-day week. The same disparity existed with port workers. The records of the large American shipping company, Farrell Lines. The criminal company is Farrell Lines. I'll put the name in there so that you can all go figure out whether it still exists under that name or it's something else and you know what to do with it. Farrell Lines. That's the company. Let's make sure we get that spelling right. We want to make sure people find out what they're all about. The records of the large American shipping company, Farrell Lines, show that in 1955, all the total amount spent on loading and discharging cargo moving between Africa and America, 5/6 went to American workers and 1/6 to Africans. Yet, it was the same amount of cargo loaded and unloaded at both ends. The wages paid to the American stevedore and the European coal miners were still such as to ensure that the capitalists made a profit. The point here is merely to illustrate how much greater was the rate of exploitation of African workers. When discrepancies such as the above were pointed out during the colonial period and subsequently, those who justified colonialism were quick to reply that the standard and cost of living was higher in capitalist countries. The fact is that the higher standard was made possible by the exploitation of colonies, and there was no justification for keeping African living standards so depressed in an age where a higher standard was possible because of the work output of Africans themselves. So, the standards of living are higher in the US, in UK. All right, cool. So when you as a white person or a Westerner go to Africa, don't ask to be paid that African wage, especially if your house is in Africa. Actually, when you move there, do not be paid a US standard, because that happens. Expatriates who go to Africa no longer have expenses in the US, will demand a paycheck that is relevant to what they're being paid in the US from Africa. You don't have the same standards of living. You have African standards of living. So adjust your salary to match that of Africans on the ground. The kind of living standard supportable by African labor within the continent is readily illustrated by the salaries and the lifestyle of the whites inside Africa. Like I just said, colonial governments discriminated against the employment of Africans in senior categories, and whenever it happened that a white and a black filled the same post, the white man was sure to be paid considerably more. What Baba Rodney is exposing here is that we accepting that and not challenging is we accepting, whether willingly or not, we accepting that white people, the false notion that white people are superior to us. You have the same job role in the same location, your expenses are the same, and the white man gets a higher salary than you. You have now, and you don't question that, because you're like, okay, at least I'm getting some. But even in that moment of at least I'm getting some, I want to keep some quiet and not cause friction in this environment, you are going along with the false notion that white people are superior to Black people. So just be cool with it. Let me not see you online complaining about racism when you do that. Don't. Just go ahead, get your check, go eat and sleep and be good. Don't complain. This was true at all levels, ranging from civil service posts to mine workers. African salaried workers in the British colonies of Gold Coast and Nigeria were better off than their brothers in many other parts of the continent, but they were restricted to the junior staff level in the civil service. I noticed this when I was working for the federal government. I'm sorry, you like this. The federal government has a lot of Africans working for it. And they want to claim diversity, right? But a lot of those Africans working for the federal government are in administrative roles that only go to a certain GS level. So the federal government goes up to 15 GS level, and then it has executives who get beyond 15. A lot of the roles that the Africans are playing, maximum GS level. That means when you're a manager in that role, is GS 11, GS 12 if it's nice. And in the federal government, most of those positions past GS 13, that is where you start seeing the diversity, not white men, white women, most of them in the United States federal government. This was true at all levels, ranging from civil service posts to mine workers. African salaried workers in the British colonies of Gold Coast and Nigeria were better off than their brothers in many other parts of the continent, but they were restricted to the junior staff level in the civil service. In the period before the last World War, European civil servants in the Gold Coast received, and by the way, for those of you who are like, oh God, why is she saying this online publicly? This is information that you can find on Google. You can go look at the percentages, the demographics of these different federal government entities, and then you can go look at the GS levels, and you can see positions in the federal government, what GS level they get. And you can also look at the demographics and see how they look for those positions. So this is stuff you can find out. It's public information. In the period before the last World War, European civil servants in the Gold Coast received an average of £40 per month, with living quarters and other privileges. Africans got an average salary of £4. There were instances where one European in an establishment earned as much as his 25 African assistants put together. One European earned as much as 25 Africans. That was one white man's salary, or woman. Outside the civil service, Africans obtained work in building projects, in mines, and as domestics, all low-paying jobs. It was exploitation without responsibility. Oh, I did request before that we ask ourselves, those of us who want to call ourselves American, what America has done for you. So if you say, oh, I have a job, we have jobs, ask yourself, what is my salary in that job? How easy is it for me to grow my career and achieve a higher level and get paid more? There were instances where outside the civil service, Africans obtained work in building projects in mines and as domestics, all low-paying jobs. It was exploitation without responsibility and without redress. In 1934, 41 Africans were killed in a gold mine disaster in the Gold Coast, and the capitalist company offered only £3 to the dependents of each of these men and as compensation. You all know this is happening right now, right? All the accidents happening in Kenya with the British Army practicing on Kenyan ground as if they don't have land in their own country to go practice their military nonsense there. And then they end up paying you pennies compared to how much they've made out of you and how much harm they've caused to your land. That is one thing that needs to happen, by the way, when we're confronting this system. Africa, if our African leaders are going to actually stand in their manhood or womanhood and claim to be good leaders, You cannot allow for external foreign militaries to come and practice and exercise and train on African land. They got their home. You are now independent. They can go, there's a lot of land in America, there's a lot of land in the UK where they can go and practice. They should take it from their own farmers. How about that? Go exploit Europeans. Go exploit British people. Take their land and claim it to be military land and use it. Stop going to Africa, and this is me venting now, but African leaders. And by saying this, I'm saying there's no African leader who is a good leader. Because as long as you have foreign entities in your country, African country, practicing, training their military, using your African land to test their weaponry, you're not a good African leader. Because you should say to those Europeans, we are a sovereign nation, we are independent, you have your own land, go there and practice there. You are causing harm to our ecosystem, you're causing harm to our people. So catch the next flight and get out. In 1934, 41 Africans were killed in a gold mine disaster in the Gold Coast, and the capitalist company offered only £3 to the dependents of each of these men as compensation. Where European settlers were found in considerable numbers, the wage differential was readily perceived. In North Africa, the wages of Moroccans and Algerians were from 16% to 25% those of Europeans. In East Africa, the position was much worse. It still is, notably in Kenya and Tanganyika. A comparison with white settler earnings and standards brings out by sharp contrast how incredibly low African wages were. While Lord Delamere, you all know Delamere, controlled 100,000 acres, he still does. It's not a past tense. Lord Delamere, his family still controls 100,000 acres of Kenya's land. The Kenyan had to carry a Kipande pass, an ID, in his own country to beg for a wage of 15 or 20 shillings per month. When you do the exchange rate, the absolute limit of brutal exploitation was found in the southern parts of the continent. And so this is what happens, right? We're talking about liberation and we're being serious. We're not playing games and we're not all talk. We want action. Today, the Kenyan government can say, Lord Delamere, your time's up. I know, yeah, you have generations. Where will they go? Oh, they can go back. You figure it out with your government that let you come here. Let them. That's their problem, not ours. But from today on, you have 24 hours to pack your everything and get out of Kenya. This is not your land. This is Kenyan land. And then the government can turn around and distribute that land to the local community so that they can grow food. They can distribute within Kenya. And then if there's excess within Africa, the neighboring East African nations, this is the type of liberation. This is liberation. That's what liberation is. You cannot claim to be liberated if a white settler is still owning land in your country and controlling how much they're paying people, how they're distributing it, who to sell it to. But as long as they're just occupying land in your country, you're not liberated. You're not independent. Just stop it. Actually, from today on, cancel Independence Day. Don't do it. The absolute limit of brutal exploitation was found in the southern parts of the continent and in southern Rhodesia. For example, agricultural laborers rarely received more than 15 shillings per month. Workers in mines got a little more if they were semi-skilled, but they also had more intolerable working conditions. Unskilled laborers in the mines of northern Rhodesia often got as little as 7 shillings per month. A truck driver on the famous copper belt was in a semi-skilled grade. In one mine, Europeans performed that job for £30 per month. So the African is getting 7 shillings per month. The European is getting £30. First of all, the number is already higher, right? 7.30. But now look at the currency. Shillings, pound. Include the exchange rate, and the number goes even higher. While in another, Africans did it for £3 per month. So I guess now we've done the exchange rate. Okay. So they're getting 30, you're getting 3, 10 times higher than what the African is being paid. In all colonial territories, wages were reduced during the period of crisis, which shook the capitalist world during the 1930s, and they were not restored or increased until after the last capitalist World War. In southern Rhodesia, in 1949, Africans employed in municipal areas were awarded minimum wages from 35 to 75 shillings per month. That was a considerable improvement over previous years, but white workers on the job for 8 hours per day, compared to the Africans, 10 or 14 hours, received a minimum wage of 20 shillings per day, plus free living quarters and other benefits. So Africans are getting 35 to 75 shillings per month. Per month. The European is getting 20 shillings per day. And a free home. And other benefits. The Rhodesians offered a miniature version of South Africa's apartheid system, which oppressed the largest industrial working class on the continent. And you still, by the way, that's the discrepancy, the difference in wages. It still exists today. And we're still allowing Europeans to settle in Africa. In the Union of South Africa, African laborers worked deep underground under inhuman conditions which would not have been tolerated by miners in Europe. Consequently, Black South African workers recovered gold from deposits which elsewhere would be regarded as non-commercial. And yet, it is the white section of the working class which received whatever benefits were available in terms of wages and salaries. Officials have admitted that the mining companies could pay whites higher than miners in any other part of the world because of the super profits made by paying Black workers a mere pittance. So now they're even rewarding the exploitation process. Like, this is how insane this, like, seriously. Now, on top of justifying paying them more, they're justifying paying them more because of the profits they make for the exploitation. In the final analysis, the shareholders of the mining companies were the ones who benefited most of all. This is going to go back to the stock market, right? Those of you who are investing in those markets, as Africans, as we confront what our participation is in the exploitation system. In the final analysis, the shareholders of the mining companies were the ones who benefited most of all. They remained in Europe and North America and collected fabulous dividends every year from the gold, diamonds, manganese, uranium, etc., which were brought out of the South African subsoil by African labor. So all you Africans online talking about how much or how well you can teach us to make great dividends out of these companies. Ask yourself what your role is in the exploitation of Africa and Africans. And you find out what it is, you're good with it, let me not find you talking about Black Lives Matter. Like, this is just the fair trade. You want to be okay with the system and continue participating, don't complain about the system. Just take it quietly and keep moving. From the very beginning of the scramble of Africa, huge fortunes were made from gold and diamonds in Southern Africa by people like Cecil Rhodes. In the present century, both the investment and the outflow of surplus have increased. Investment was mainly concentrated in mining and finance, where the profits were greatest. And I'm not saying this because I have readed myself of every participation in this capitalist system that's exploiting Africans. No, I haven't. Unfortunately not. But what are you doing as an African to counter that behavior, right? To counter that participation? What are you doing to slowly get us out of that system? Are you even involved in any anti-capitalist actions? Because that's what you should do. Yes, you're still reliant. Yes, you're still dependent on it. But what are you putting in to the anti-capitalist movement, the anti-colonial, the anti-imperialist movement to slowly get us out? In the mid 1950s, British investments in South Africa were estimated at £860 million and yielded a stable profit of 15% or £129 million every year. That's in one African country. Most mining companies had returns well above that average. De Beers Consolidated Mines made a profit that was both phenomenal and consistently high, between 26 million and 29 million throughout the 1950s. I wish today Black people, African people in the Western countries, in the United States, could have the kahunas, the balls, the blackosity, I don't know what to call it, the bravery to go today to your employer. It might be employment suicide, but to go today and say, I deserve a bigger salary. You are making this much from Africa every year. Like, just go get the numbers and just come with them at the table. When you go for your interviews and they offer you like pennies for your salary, you say, no, this is how much I'm requesting to be paid. This is how much you're all making from Africa every year. I'm an African descendant. Yes, this is how much I'm requesting. I'm not accepting this offer. The complex of Southern African mining concerns operated not just in South Africa itself, but also in Southwest Africa. And by the way, if you do that, send me an email when you get the job, because I would love to just relish in that happiness. It's the petty moments that just give us pleasure. Petty moments of African bravery, African overcome of the system. Angola, and they're not petty when you think about it. The complex of Southern African mining concerns operated not just in South Africa itself, but also in Southwest Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and the Congo. Congo was consistently a source of immense wealth for Europe, because from the time of colonization until 1906, King Leopold II of Belgium made at least 20 million from rubber and ivory. The period of mineral exploitation started quite early and then gained momentum after political control passed from King Leopold to the Belgian state in 1906. Total foreign capital inflow into the Congo between 1887 and 1953 was estimated by the Belgians to have been 5,700 million pounds. This is in 1887. 1887! Between 1887 and 1953, 5,700 million pounds. The value of the outflow in the same period was said to have been 4,300 million pounds, exclusive of profits retained within the Congo. As was true everywhere else on the continent, the expatriation of surplus from Congo increased as the colonial period wore on. In the 5 years preceding independence, the net outflow of capital from Congo to Belgium reached massive proportions. Most of the expatriation of surplus was handled by a major European finance monopoly, the Societe Generale. Or let me put that other criminal in the chat so that you can see how we pronounce it and you can check them out. These people want to go around calling Black people criminals. Well, they are the biggest criminals. Talking about terrorists, why they are the ones terrorizing Africans all over the world and brown people. And we're supposed to be quiet and play along because we don't want to cause trouble. We don't want to upset them. Just be quiet and play along. Why are you so angry, Nduku? Why can't you just smile? I'll tell you when I'll smile. When you get out of Africa and stop exploiting us, I'll smile. I'll smile from here to here. That's the company. The Societe Generale had as its most important subsidiary the Union Minière du Haut Katanga, which has monopolized Congolese copper. Oh, there's another criminal to mention. Hold on. And a lot of times, these European nations or companies, they change their names. They change their names a lot of times. So just go when you look, go down the rabbit hole and figure out what they're called today, because they change their names to disassociate themselves with the horrors that they have caused throughout centuries. Yeah. When it was known as the Compagnie de Katanga, Union Miniere has been known to make a profit of £25 million in a single year. £25 million in a single year. And you dare tell a black person who comes to look for a job there that they're going to earn 53,000 a year. No, black people, sit there and say, nope, this is what I would like to be paid. It is no wonder that of the total wealth produced in Congo in any given year during the colonial period, more than 1/3 went out in the form of profits for big business and salaries for the expatriate staffs. But the comparable figure for Northern Rhodesia under the British was 1/2. In Katanga, Union Miniere at least had a reputation for leaving some of the profits behind in the form of things like housing and maternity services for African workers. The Rhodesian Copper Belt companies expatriated profits without compunction. It should not be forgotten that outside South Africa, there were also significant mining operations during the colonial period. In North Africa, foreign capital exploited natural resources of phosphates, oil, lead, zinc, manganese, and iron ore. In Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, there were important workings of gold, diamonds, iron ore, and bauxite. To all that should be added the tin of Nigeria, to all that should be added the tin of Nigeria, the gold and manganese of Ghana, the gold and diamonds of Tanganyika, and the copper of Uganda and Congo Brazzaville. In each case, an understanding of the situation must begin with an inquiry into the degree of exploitation of African resources and labor, and then must proceed to follow the surplus to its destination outside Africa, into the bank accounts of the capitalists who control the majority shares in the huge multinational mining companies. The African working class produced a less spectacular surplus for export with regard to companies engaged in agriculture. Agriculture plantations were widespread in North, East, and South Africa, and they also appeared in West Africa to a lesser extent. Their profits depended on the incredibly low wages and harsh working conditions imposed on African agricultural laborers, and on the fact that they invested very little capital in obtaining the land, which was robbed wholesale from Africans by colonial powers and then sold to whites at nominal prices. I mentioned there's a white there are white people in Tanzania who've bought land and are growing coffee and are selling coffee internationally from that farm. They do not pay their workers a fair, reasonable living wage. They do not treat their workers well. If I was a Tanzanian, I would make sure I no longer work there. Or if I was a Tanzanian who was capable, I would make sure I provide an alternative for wages for those Tanzanians working there. Tanzanians working there, so that they can get out of there, so that this company no longer has the power to exploit Tanzanians. Run it out of business. For instance, after the Kenyan highlands had been declared crown land, remember we're talking about Kenyan land. So now these white people come to Kenyan land, and then now they want to call it their land. So after the Kenyan highlands had been declared crown land, the British, and I'm going to say this real quick because we're getting ready now on Kumbukeni to celebrate Dedan Kimathi this coming week. His birthday is on October 31st. Dedan Kimathi was a leader of the Kenya Land Freedom Army, also known as, erroneously known as Mau Mau. And Kenya does not celebrate Mau Mau Day or whatever you want to call it. Kenya Land Freedom. We celebrate Mashujaa Day, which just passed, which is Warriors Day. But in that, I don't remember, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Kenyans, a highlight on the role that the Kenya Land Freedom Army played in getting a lot of Kenyan land back. For instance, after the Kenya highlands had been declared Crown land, the British handed over to Lord Delamere 100,000 acres. Hold on, so that you come at me, when you want to come at me telling me why am I sending Delamere and his descendants out of Kenya. He did not buy it. The British handed over. They took the land that was Kenya's land, named it their own land, claimed ownership. They did not buy it. They took it and then handed it over to Lord Delamere, 100,000 acres at a cost of a penny per acre. So that's 100,000 pennies, whatever that was then. So we can decide as Kenyans if we want to be nice and we're not going to pay interest. We're going to give Lord Delamere and his family 100,000 pennies back. That's what he paid for the land. Lord Francis Scott purchased 350,000 acres, the East African Estates Limited. That's another company, the East African Estates Limited. Let's figure out what that looks like today. East African Estates Limited. I wonder what company that is today. Got another 350,000 acres, and the East African Syndicate took 100,000 acres adjoining Lord Delamere's estate, all at giveaway prices. And today, even today, when you're driving on the Rift Valley Road, you will see that land is just massive land that still belongs to them. Needless to say, such plantations made huge profits, even if the rate was lower than in a South African gold mine or an gold and diamond mine. During the colonial era, Liberia was supposedly independent, but to all intents and purposes, it was a colony of the United States. Oh, hold on. Black people who want to defend Liberia as an independent country. During the colonial era, Liberia was supposedly independent, but to all intents and purposes, it was a colony of the United States. For those of you who want to claim the United States never colonized, not to mention that they are currently colonizing Black people, but conversation for another day, within the United States. In 1926, the Firestone Rubber Company of the United States was able to acquire 1 million acres of forest land in Liberia at a cost of 6 cents per acre and 1% of the value of the exported rubber. How, Nduku, you claim the United States is colonizing Black people in the United States? How would you say that? Black people are free. We had emancipation. We celebrate emancipation every day. We celebrate Juneteenth, Nduku. How dare you say that the United States is colonizing Black people? Okay, Black people, can you go wherever you want to go today? You can just go wherever you want to go today and be yourself. Anywhere. You can get whatever salary you want. You can buy a house anywhere you go to. No one is going to question you. No one is going to tell you all of a sudden, oh, it's not available anymore, the apartment. We're not talking about you as an individual. We're talking about the collective of Black people. Today in the United States, are there any Black people who are still being told when they show up, they sounded white for some reason because they are under this education system on the phone, and when they show up with their blackity self, the realtor, all of a sudden the apartment has been taken? Does that still exist? How are the police treating Black people in the United States? How are the states treating Black people in the United States? Are you all allowed to teach your history? Are the books that you write being distributed equally? Yeah, you're colonized. During the colonial era, Liberia was supposedly independent, but to all intents and purposes, it was a colony of the United States. In 1926, the Firestone Rubber Company of the United States was able to acquire 1 million acres of forest land in Liberia at a cost of 6 cents per acre and 1% of the value of the exported rubber. Because of the demand for, Firestone, y'all. Firestone. You all know Firestone. I don't need to write that in the chat. You all know Firestone. In 1926, the Firestone Rubber Company of the United States was able to acquire 1 million acres of forest land in Liberia at a cost of 6 cents per acre and 1% of the value of the exported rubber. Because of the demand for and the strategic importance of rubber, Firestone's profits from Liberia's land and labor carried them to 25th position among the giant companies of the United States. We want to talk about reparations, like if we really, really wanted to have this conversation. Black people should be buying Firestone tires at a much lower rate than white people if we're going to talk about reparations and repairing the harm. You, Firestone, want to still exist, right? And run your business. Okay, this is the deal with the global Black community. To Black people, this should be your rate for the tires, considering how much you made throughout the years. Off of Black labor, off of Black pain, off of Black bodies, off of Black resources. White people will pay more because they weren't treated the way you treated us for your tires. And Black people will pay less. That's reparations. European trading companies versus the African peasant. So far, this section has been dealing with that part of the surplus produced by African wage earners in mines and plantations. But the African working class under colonialism was extremely small, and the vast majority of Africans engaged in the colonial money economy were independent peasants. How then can it be said that these self-employed peasants were contributing to the expatriation of African surplus? Apologists for colonialism argue that it was a positive benefit for such farmers to have been given the opportunity to create surplus by growing or collecting produce such as cocoa, coffee, palm oil. It is essential that this misinterpretation be clarified. A peasant growing a cash crop or collecting produce had his labor exploited by a long chain of individuals, starting with local businessmen. Sometimes the local businessmen were Europeans. Very rarely were they Africans, and more usually, they were a minority group brought in from outside and serving as intermediaries between the white colonialists and the exploited African peasant, aka Indians. In West Africa, the Lebanese and Syrians played this role, while in East Africa, the Indians rose to this position. Arabs were also in the middleman category in Zanzibar and a few other places on the East African coast. Cash crop peasants never had any capital of their own. They existed from one crop to another, depending on good harvests and good prices. Any bad harvest or fall of prices caused the peasants to borrow in order to find money to pay taxes and buy certain necessities. As security, they mortgaged their future crops to moneylenders in the middleman category. Non-payment of debts could and did lead to their farms being taken away by the moneylenders. The rate of interest on the loans was always fantastically high, amounting to what is known as usury. In East Africa, things were so bad. Now, I am going to go there. Some of these people were Arabs. In Islam, usury is forbidden. If these middlemen were Arabs who practiced Islam and were practicing this behavior, I'm just saying, in East Africa, things were so bad that even the British colonial government had to step in and enact a native credit ordinance to protect Africans from Asian businessmen. However, in spite of some minor clashes between the colonialists and the middlemen, the two were part and parcel of the same apparatus of exploitation. On the whole, the Lebanese and Indians did the smaller jobs which Europeans could not be bothered with. They owned things such as cotton gins, which separated the seed from the lint, while of course Europeans concentrated on the cotton mills in Europe. The middlemen also went out to the villages, while Europeans liked to stay in towns. In the villages, the Indians and Lebanese took over virtually all buying and selling, channeling most of the profits back to Europeans in the towns and those overseas. The share profits, which went to middlemen, was insignificant in comparison to those profits reaped by big European business interests and by the European governments themselves. So for those Kenyans who want to talk about, look at how successful Indians are. Oh, look at how hard they work. Indians are successful because they exploited you. The capitalist institution which came into most direct contact with African peasants was the colonial trading company. That is to say, a company specializing in moving goods to and from the colonies. The most notorious were the French concerns, Compagnie Françoise d'Afrique Occidentale, CFAO, and Société Commerciale Ouest Africaine. Yeah, someone needs. And the British-controlled United Africa Company, UAC. So I'm just going to write the acronyms, and hopefully you can find them, because these are long. SCOA. Well, the British-controlled United Africa Company, UO. Those are the companies. So the first one, when you look for the acronym so that you're hearing it now, and when you find whatever it is, Compagnie Françoise d'Afrique Occidentale. Société Commerciale Ouest Africaine. And then the British-controlled United Africa Company. I'm not trying to sound perfect French here. I'm African. I don't speak French. These were responsible for expatriating a great proportion of Africa's wealth produced by peasant toil. Several of the colonial trading companies already had African blood on their hands from participation in the slave trade. Thus, after French merchants in Boudoir made fortunes from the European slave trade, they transferred that capital to the trade in groundnuts from Senegal and Gambia in the middle of the 19th century. The farms concerned continued to operate in the colonial period, although they changed hands and there were a lot of mergers. So, when you're looking up these companies, be aware of that. In Senegal, we have 1 more hour left. We will read until where we can. Yeah, I doubt we're going to be able to finish the chapter. It's long. It's huge. Several of the colonial trading companies, these were responsible for expatriating a great proportion of Africa's wealth produced by peasant toil. Several of the colonial trading companies already had African blood on their hands for participation in the slave trade. Thus, after French merchants in Boudoir made fortunes from the European slave trade, they transferred that capital to the trade in groundnuts from Senegal and Gambia in the middle of the 19th century. The farms concerned continued to operate in the colonial period, although they changed hands and there were a lot of mergers. In Senegal, Mauritania, and Mali, the names of Moril and Prom, Moril brothers, Buhan and I'm going to slow down on the names. These are the criminals. The names of Morel and Prom, Morel brothers, Buhan and Tayseri, Dalmas and Clastri were all well known. Several of them were eventually incorporated into SCOA, the Société Commerciale Ouest Africaine, which was dominated by a consortium of French and Swiss financiers. When you all want to talk about private entities, they have nothing to do with it. Oh, no, they do. A parallel process in the French port of Marseilles led to the transfer of slave trade capital into direct trade between Africa and France. After the end of the First World War, most of the small Marseilles farms were absorbed into the massive CFAO, Compagnie Françoise d'Afrique Occidentale, which imported into French West Africa whatever European goods the market would take. And exported in turn the agricultural produce that was largely the consequence of peasant labor. CFAO, but that's, so Africans, this is what's happening. You're being exploited in a double way. They're taking your resources and then they're manufacturing and bringing you the end products and forcing you to buy them. So for those Africans who want to say, oh, I bought something from France. This is from France. This is from the United States. Yeah, you're helping in the exploitation of Africa. After the end of the First World War, most of the small Marseilles farms were absorbed. CFAO also had British and Dutch capital, and its activities extended into Liberia and into British and Belgian colonies. So in case you mention that company and the Brits and the Dutch want to say, we had nothing to do with that. Nope. That company was able to continue doing business because the Brits gave it capital and the Dutch gave it capital. It is said that SCOA and CFAO made a profit of up to 90% in good years and 25%. Profit margin of 90% and 25% in bad years. In Britain, the notorious slave trading port of Liverpool was the first to switch to palm oil early in the 19th century, when the trade in slaves became difficult or impossible. So profit margin, let me explain that. That is the money you get after you've put in money. It is the money you get more than what you put in. And so you take the total of what you put in and the money that you get. I mean, what you put in is expenses and everything, and the money you get. I'm not an economist, so I might get this wrong, but this is me understanding it as a layman. The money you put in your expenses, and the money you make, right? You have sold the things that you have produced and you made money. The profit is what you take the money you make, you subtract the money you put in, that money that you're left with after taking off the expenses, compared to the whole sum, is that percentage, the profit margin. 90% profit margin, which means your expenses are only 10%. In Britain, the notorious slave trading port of Liverpool was the first to switch to palm oil early in the 19th century, when the trade in slaves became difficult or impossible. This meant that Liverpool firms were no longer exploiting Africa by removing its labor physically to another part of the world. They were not practicing in enslavement of Africans. Instead, they were exploiting the labor and raw materials of Africa inside Africa. So they were no longer, these are the Brits who were so nice. We don't want this practice of enslaving Africans. It is crude. How dare you, America? Oh, but we're still going to remain in Africa, and we're going to use that labor in Africa. Throughout the 19th century and right into the colonial era, Liverpool concentrated largely on importing African peasant produce. Backed by the industrial districts of Manchester and Cheshire, this British port was in control of a great proportion of Britain's and Europe's trade with Africa in the colonial period, just as it had done in the slave trade period. So this is just them advancing their business. How can we avoid the risk and increase the profit? Glasgow also had a keen interest in the colonial trade, and so did the merchants and big business interests of London. By 1929, London replaced Liverpool as the chief port dealing with African import and export. As indicated, the UAC was the British company which was best known among the commercial concerns. It was a subsidiary of the giant Anglo-Dutch monopoly, Unilever. Unilever. And its agencies were found in all the British colonies of West Africa and on a smaller scale in East Africa. Now, if you go to Unilever and you find that a Black person is being paid less or is not allowed, like for those of you who are doing diversity, equity, and inclusion, this like just gives you, if you can all just stand united, those of you doing DEIA and work together as Black people, you can go to these companies and say, hey, why do you not have Black people? You've been exploiting Africa for all these years. Why do you have, like, make that colonial case, that imperialist argument. If you're going to have Black people in your company, you're going to pay them a certain wage, minimum, because you've made this amount of profits for years. Like, that has to be included in the DEI argument, honestly, moving forward. How much these companies have made out of the exploitation of Africa. DEI needs to move to that if you're going to be genuine about that work. Not only are you going to ask those companies to hire more Black people and pay them better and treat them well, you're going to look at what their role is in colonialism and then ask for reparations through that process of paying them better, offering jobs, and treating them well. Backed by the industrial districts of Manchester and we read that. By 1929, London replaced Liverpool as the chief port dealing with African import and export. As indicated, the UAC was the British company which was best known among the commercial concerns. It was a subsidiary of the giant Anglo-Dutch monopoly, Unilever, and its agencies were found in all the British colonies of West Africa and on a smaller scale in East Africa. Unilever also controlled the Compagnie du Niger François, the Compagnie François de la Côte d'Ivoire, SCKM in charge, Nosoko in Senegal, NOSOCO in Senegal, NSCA in Portuguese Guinea, like for Guinea to still, and John Walken and Company Limited in Dahomey. Certain other British and French farms were not found in every colony, but they did well in the particular area in which they were entrenched. For example, there was John Holt in Nigeria. In East Africa, the import-export business tended to have smaller farms than in West Africa. But even so, there were 5 or 6 which were much larger than the rest and appropriated the largest amounts. One of the oldest was Smith Mackenzie, which was an offshoot of the Scottish company of Mackinnon and Mackenzie. I've seen that name, which had spearheaded British colonization in East Africa. Smith Mackenzie and Mackinnon and Mackenzie spearheaded British colonization in East Africa, and which also had interests in India. Other notable commercial farms were those of A. Bowman, Wigglesworth and Company, Dalgetty, Leslie and Anderson, Raleigh Brothers, Michael Corns, Jos Hansen. We've seen that. That name still exists. The African Mercantile, and 20 Twench Overseas Trading Company. Some of them amalgamated before colonial rule was over, and they all had several other subsidiaries, as well as themselves being related to bigger companies in the metropoles. The UAC, you can find out that information. When you look up these companies, you'll be able to go down the rabbit hole. That means you're looking at several pages of Google, not just the front page. And you can see what these companies have now become. The UAC also had a slice of the East African import trade, having brought up the ram of Gailey and Roberts, which was started by white settlers in 1904. The pattern of appropriation of surplus in East Africa was easy to follow, in that there was centralization of the extractive mechanisms in Nairobi and the port of Mombasa. So when we're talking about, oh, let's boycott that ram, let's boycott that company, let's boycott this and that, and Black people are like, oh Lord, we're going to be left with nothing to use. We're going to be left with no ram to drink because it's all affiliated with colonialism. Okay, so Black people, here's a solution. Why don't you all start coming together, put your monies together, and start investing in a company, a Black company that will produce ram? How about that as a solution? All the big farms operated from Nairobi, with important offices in Mombasa to deal with warehousing, shipping, insuring. Uganda and Tanganyika were then brought into the picture via their capital cities of Kampala and Dar es Salaam, where the big farms had branches. Up to the start of the last war, the volume of trade from East Africa was fairly small, but it jumped rapidly after that. For instance, the value of Kenyan imports rose from £4 million in 1938 to £34 million in 1950, and to 70 million in 1960, from 34 to 70. That is more than double in 10 years. The value of exports was, of course, rising at the same time, and the commercial farms were among the principal beneficiaries of the growth in foreign trade. I forget what the amount I saw CARICOM requesting for reparations is. As I continue to read these numbers, I'm like, man, you're not asking for enough. Trading companies made huge fortunes on relatively small investments in those parts of Africa where peasant cash crop farming was widespread. The companies did not have to spend a penny to grow the agricultural raw materials. The African peasant went in for cash crop farming for many reasons. And I'll say this also as we talk about reparations. It has to go beyond cash money. It has also to go to policy. It has also to go to terms of exchange and trade and all that and relations. That's part of the reparations. It has to be in the fact that the US, as part of reparations, can no longer have military bases in Africa or any African nation. That the US, if you're going to do business in Africa, it has to be through African terms, not your terms. If you're going to have Americans working in Africa and that's where they're living and that's where their expenses are, they'll be paid like Africans, same rate for the same job. This is part of reparations. The value of exports was, of course, rising at the same time, and the commercial firms were among the principal beneficiaries of the growth in foreign trade. Trading companies made huge fortunes on relatively small investments in those parts of Africa where peasant cash crop farming was widespread. The companies did not have to spend a penny to grow the agricultural raw materials, so they were enslaving Africans in Africa. If they did not have to spend a penny to grow the agricultural raw materials, but there were Africans growing them, That means they were enslaving Africans in Africa. The African peasant went in for cash crop farming for many reasons. A minority eagerly took up the opportunity to continue to acquire European goods, which they had become accustomed to during the pre-colonial period. Many others in every section of the continent took to earning cash because they had to pay various taxes in money or because they were forced to work. Good examples of Africans literally being forced to grow cash crops by gun and whip were to be found in Tanganyika under German rule, in Portuguese colonies, and in French Equatorial Africa and the French Sudan in the 1930s. For those of you who think you're special because you're a descendant of enslavement in the United States, think again. There were Africans enslaved in Africa under gun and whip, being forced to work and produce. In any event, there were very few cases where the peasant was wholly dependent on the cash for his actual sustenance. The trading companies took full advantage of that fact. Knowing that an African peasant and his family would keep alive by their own food shambas, the companies had no obligation to pay prices sufficient for the maintenance of a peasant and his family, despite the fact that they're taking them away from growing the food on their shambas. They're penalizing them from growing certain foods. So they're placing barriers for them to grow the food in their shambas so that they can have sustenance. But then they're justifying not paying them and saying they have their own shambas. In a way, the companies were simply receiving tribute from a conquered people without even the necessity to trouble themselves as to how the tributary goods were produced. Trading companies also had their own means of transport inside Africa, such as motor vessels and trucks. But usually, they transferred the burden of transport costs onto the peasant via the Lebanese and Indian middlemen. Those capitalist companies held the African farmer in a double squeeze by controlling the price paid for the crop and by controlling the price of imported goods such as tools, clothing, and bicycles to which peasants aspired. For example, so here's the thing with free trade. So United States, Britain, France, Germany, China, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, whatever other foreign entity, as long as you're not Africa, wants to bring your goods to Africa, you're not going to determine the price. If you want a free market in Africa, we're going to determine the price. And in exchange, we're also going to determine the price of the goods coming from Africa, and we're going to manufacture them in Africa. We're talking about how does this look later in life, right? This relationship. That's how it looks. You want to have for us to go along with this whole free market thing of free trade? Okay, you want to bring goods from the US. We're going to tell you how much we're buying them for. For example, prices of palm products, or we're not going to buy them. Prices of palm products were severely reduced by the UAC and other trading companies in Nigeria in 1929, while the cost of living was rising owing to increased charges for imported goods. Nduku, how can you say that? That's not how we do things. Or how about we change the way we do things and have a revolution and start doing things in a different way? In 1924, the price for palm oil had been 14 shillings per gallon. This fell to 7 in 1928 and to slightly over 1 shilling in the following year. Although the trading companies received less for every toil of palm oil during the Depression years, their profit margin increased, showing how brazenly surplus was being pounded out of the peasant. In the midst of the Depression, the UAC was showing a handsome profit during the Depression. The profits in 1934 were 6,302,875 pounds. No, 6,302,875 pounds. And a dividend of 15% was paid on ordinary shares. In every part of colonial Africa, the Depression years followed the same pattern. In Sukumaland, Tanganyika, the price of cotton dropped in 1930 from 50 cents to 10 cents per pound because you're allowing them to determine the price. The French colonies, so now if in their country they're hit with an economic crisis, aka the Depression, then they don't have the money to buy your goods. If they're determining what they're going to pay to get your goods, they're obviously going to reduce that. But if you as Africans are determining what the price is, you're going to be like, oh, tough luck. It's still that price. All the best. The French colonies were hit a little later because the depression did not make its impact on the French monetary zone until after 1931. Then, prices of Senegalese groundnuts were cut by more than half. So, how does that look like in contemporary times? You're all becoming dependent on the dollar. When the dollar loses its value, and it will lose its value, when it does lose its value, the commodities coming in and the commodities going out, the prices for those will be determined by the US because you have left them with the power of determining the price. Coffee and cocoa dropped even further since they were relative luxuries to the European buyer. Again, and you should ask yourself, Africans, so now that the dollar is doing well, why are we not getting cheaper goods? Like, why are they not reducing the price of what they're selling to us? Coffee and cocoa dropped even further since they were relative luxuries to the European buyer. Again, it can be noted that French firms such as CFAO and SCOA, faced lower prices when they sold the raw materials in Europe, but they never absorbed any losses. Instead, because they're covering it on the other side, African peasants and workers bore the pressure, even if it meant forced labor. You Kenyans, you Zambians, I was speaking to Sister Florence yesterday, who now all of a sudden high tax, right? All of a sudden you cannot afford food. You're basically covering the bottom, what's it called? The percentage of loss in the Western countries, right? If things are not good there, you're the ones who are going to have increased prices so that you can cover that loss. Instead, African peasants and workers bore the pressure, even if it meant forced labor. African peasants in French territories were forced to join so-called cooperative societies, which made them grow certain crops like cotton and made them accept whatever price was offered. I was talking to an individual or a group of people on Instagram who had posted something about them having land in West African country. I forget where. Senegal, maybe. I forget. And they're going to start producing. It was a cash crop. And how that was progress. And they were thanking some Americans who are involved in this whole deal. And I said to them, listen, are you all looking at how you're going to provide food for that community? You want to talk about the Americans are being nice for helping you. No, they're not. They're making you come together in this illusion of community togetherness and unity, but they're making you come together to destroy and deprive you from having your own food, to come together to produce cash crops for them, that you will end up giving to them, selling to them, let's call it selling, for a very little price compared to what they will make once it comes on the other end. Hardly had the Depression ended when Europe was at war. The Western powers dragged in the African people to fight for freedom. The trading firms stepped up the rate of plunder in the name of God and country. On the Gold Coast, they paid £10 per ton for cocoa beans as compared to £50 before the war. At the same time, the price of imported goods doubled and trebled. Many necessities passed beyond the reach of the ordinary man. On the Gold Coast, a piece of cotton print which had sold before the war for 12.5 shillings was 90 shillings in 1945. So because you have these criminals deciding what the prices are, during their depression, when they decide to reduce the money they're paying you for the resources, they increase the money that they're charging you for the manufactured goods they bring back to you. Like, that doesn't even make sense that Africans are going along with this. In Nigeria, a yard of khaki, which was 3 shillings in poor days, went up to 16. A bundle of iron sheets formerly costing 30 went up to 100. You all want to ask yourselves why food has become expensive. That's why. Because it's not yours. It's not produced in Africa. That's why. And because you're not controlling the prices. Kenyans, Zambians, Africans who are complaining grocery store. And I was there earlier this year. I know how ridiculously expensive it is. That's why. Because number one, the food, the stuff, first of all, number one, you're reliant on grocery stores. That's the beginning, the problem. You're not growing them in your gardens like you used to do. I grew up where my grandma would send us to the garden to pick peas, to pick tomatoes, to pick onions for food, for dinner. Where she had so much, she would send to. And my grandma is one of two wives to my grandpa. And each of them had 10 children. And they all have grandchildren. I'm a grandchild. So you can imagine how many people these are. And a lot of those families, in fact, all of them would get stuff from my grandma sent to them in the city, out of the garden. And now a lot of those families are going to Sarit Center, to whatever Tasca supermarket, whatever supermarket. That is what you're reliant on. Because now we're not growing for ourselves. That's part of the problem. And then the other part of the problem is that the goods you're buying are not being manufactured in Africa. And you're not the one determining what the price will be. And even when these lands that are determining what price it will be are not doing well, and therefore they are purchasing the resources that end up making those goods that come back to you at a lower cost, they're not reducing the price of the end products that are coming to you. They're increasing the price. So you're always losing, Africans. Urban workers were hardest hit by rising prices, since they had to purchase everyday necessities with money and part of their food was imported. I literally just painted that picture for you all. Worker dissatisfaction highlighted this exploitative post-war situation. There were several strikes, and in the Gold Coast, the boycott of imported goods in 1948 is famous as the prelude to self-government under Nkrumah. However, peasants were also restless under low prices and expensive imports. In Uganda, the cotton-growing peasants could stand things no longer by 1947. They could not get their hands on the big British import-export firms, but they could at least deal with the Indian and African middlemen. So they marched against the... Next time, I'm advising you Africans to go for the British import-export firms. That's who you should go for, because I know recently there were protests in Kenya because of the high taxation. So they marched against the Indian-owned cotton gins and demonstrated outside the palace of the Kabaka, the hereditary ruler who often functioned as a British agent in Uganda. To ensure that at all times the profit margin was kept as high as possible, the trading firms found it convenient to form pools. The pools fixed the price to be paid to the African cultivator and kept the price down to the minimum. In addition, the trading companies spread into several other aspects of the economic life of the colonies in such a way as to introduce several straws for the striking out of surplus. In Morocco, to give one example, the Compagnie Générale du Maroc, French-owned, owned large estates, livestock farms, timber workings, mines, fisheries, railways, ports, and power stations. I will ask you all today, how much does Bill Gates own in Africa? The giants like CFAO and UAC also had their fingers in everything. CFAO's interests ranged from groundnut plantations to shares in the Fabry and Freycinet shipping line. The people of Ghana and Nigeria met the UAC everywhere they turned. It controlled wholesale and retail trade, owned butter factories, sawmills, soap factories, singlet factories, cold storage plants, engineering and motor repair shops, tags, coastal boats. Some of those businesses directly exploited African wage labor, while in one way or another, all operations skimmed the cream produced by peasant efforts in the cash crop sector. So they basically own everything. Sometimes the firms which purchased agricultural products in Africa were the same concerns which manufactured goods based on those agricultural raw materials. For instance, Cadbury. Oh, Cadbury. This is one thing Nduku is coming to confront herself with. I love Cadbury chocolate. It tastes good. From today on, Nduku is no longer eating Cadbury chocolate. Those of you who are with me, who see me, who hang out with me, you see me opening a Cadbury chocolate, please hold me accountable. And you know how you hold me accountable? By the way, this is something we should have this agreement as Africans. So, how much was that Cadbury chocolate Nduku? You're opening it. Instead of throwing it in the garbage because you already spent the money, you're going to take that money, you're going to send it to an organization that needs it to continue the work of liberation. The same exact money you bought that Cadbury. Actually, maybe we should start charging each other interest for the crime of participating. Because I can avoid buying Cadbury chocolate. It's not going to change my life. Maybe we as Africans, as we hold each other accountable, should start doing that. You find me eating that Cadbury chocolate, find me for the price I bought for it and interest, and ask me to send that to an organization, an African organization that is doing the work of liberating Africans. For instance, Cadbury and Fry, the two foremost English manufacturers, just in case I forget, the two foremost English manufacturers of cocoa and chocolate were buyers of the West African coast, while in East Africa, the tea manufacturing concern of Brook Bond. By the way, that's another thing. We must buy those farms back. Must. African governments, if you're going to call yourself leaders and bringing progress, the best leader, the leader that's needed. Apparently, there's a leader in Africa who claimed recently that he's the leader that's needed in these tough times. Okay, so you're the leader that's needed in these tough times. Okay, I know your country produces a lot of tea, and I know that tea is still owned by Western companies. So you're the best leader for these tough times? How about that? You give the pink slip to these Western entities, they have to leave. And then you take those lands and then you sell at a reasonable price, very, very reasonable price to Kenyans, communities of Kenyans, so that they can start producing tea for Kenya and for the rest of Africa. If we have excess, we can sell it to the West at our own decided price. Many of the Marcellus, Boudoir, and Liverpool trading companies were also engaged in manufacturing items such as soap and margarine in their home territories. This applied fully to the UAC, while the powerful Leisure group processing oils and fats in France had commercial buyers in Africa. However, it is possible to separate the trading operations from the industrial ones. The latter represented the final stage in the long process of exploiting the labor of African peasants, in some ways the most damaging stage. Peasants worked for large numbers of hours to produce a given cash crop, and the price of the product was the price of those long hours of labor. Since primary produce from Africa has always received low prices, it follows that the buyer and user of the raw material was engaging in massive exploitation of the peasants. The above generalization can be illustrated with reference to cotton, which is one of the most widely encountered cash crops in Africa. Widely. The Ugandan farmer, let me just take a sip of water and we can sit with this, take it slow with this paragraph. Because Baba Rodney is empowering us to see how the exploitation happens, right? The above generalization can be illustrated with reference to cotton, which is one of the most widely encountered cash crops in Africa. The Ugandan farmer grew cotton, which ultimately made its way into an English factory in Lancashire or a British-owned factory in India. So the cotton is not going to a factory in Uganda. It's being bagged right from the farm to the plane, landing in Lancashire or a British-owned factory in India. Because at that time, maybe they don't have them in Kenya. So those of you who are talking about these companies are coming to Kenya and you think it's the best thing that ever happened to you, not just Kenya, Africa. No. As long as they're still controlling the business of those companies and still labeling those products as British, they're still exploiting you. The Lancashire factory owner paid his workers as little as possible, but his exploitation of their labor was limited by several factors. His exploitation of the labor of the Ugandan peasant was unlimited because of his power in the colonial state, which ensured that Ugandans worked long hours for very little. So this is colonial times, right? This person has a farm and he's hired Ugandans all. we'll call it hire. He's exchanging. He's giving them some payment, but very little. But he's also able to control that payment that he gives you because he's a part of the government, deciding the policies that determine how much you should earn. Besides the price of the finished, for those of you who have members of the World Bank in positions in in African governments, besides the price of the finished cotton shirt was so high that when re-imported into Uganda, cotton in the form of a shirt was beyond the purchasing power of the peasant who grew the cotton. So I'm growing cotton all day. I'm getting paid very little to grow it all day. I'm not able to produce food for myself, so I don't have food because I'm here growing cotton and I'm actually penalized for growing food. But hold up, I need a shirt. Oh no, I can't afford that shirt. I helped produce the cotton that made that shirt. The differences between the prices of African exports of raw materials and the importation of manufactured goods constituted a form of unequal exchange. Throughout the colonial period, we spoke about Mitumba. I think I was in a LinkedIn room the other day. I didn't get to speak, but I put it in the chat, explaining what the Mitumba industry has done to Africa. So they're producing that cotton shirt that you cannot afford as a peasant. We're talking now contemporary times, right? But hold on. The European man who is paid more than you, who is hired because he's European, has the salary to afford that shirt. He's going to wear it for a few weeks and he's going to need, I'm tired of that. Let me put it in the bin. We're giving away clothes. The companies and organizations that get these used clothes will package them, will send them to Africa. It will be sold at a certain price that now you can afford and you're thankful for. And the money will go back. Throughout the colonial period, this inequality in exchange got worse. Economists refer to the process as one of the deteriorating terms of trade. In 1939, with the same quality of primary goods, colonies could buy only 60% of manufactured goods, which they bought in the decade 1870 to 1880 before colonial rule. By 1960, the amount of European manufactured goods purchasable by the same quantity of African raw materials had fallen still further. There was no objective economic law which determined that primary produce should be worth so little. Indeed, the developed countries sold certain raw materials like timber and wheat at much higher prices than a colony could command. Those of you who are going to Ukraine to beg for wheat. The explanation is that the unequal exchange was forced upon Africa by the political and military supremacy of the colonizers. Just as in the sphere of international relations, unequal treaties were forced upon small states in the dependencies like those in Latin America. For those of you who don't understand, when they say we're protecting, defending US interests, we're protecting and defending UK, British interests, we're protecting and defending French interests. These are the interests they're talking about. That's why their military is there, to make sure that you're not complaining about the prices. The unequal nature of the trade between the metropole, to make sure that dare you African leaders decide to finally become leaders, they will rise up against you. The unequal nature of the trade between the metropole and the colonies was emphasized by the concept of the protected market, which meant even an inefficient metropolitan producer could find a guaranteed market in the colony where his class had political control. So even I have to be seriously? Okay. Even the worst of businessmen in these Western countries, whose product is just the worst, who his own countrymen cannot even buy, or her own countrymen cannot buy, has a market in Africa. Furthermore, as in the preceding era of pre-colonial trade, European manufacturers built up useful sidelines of goods which would have been substandard in their own markets, especially in textiles. The European farmer always gained in the same way by selling cheap butter, while the Scandinavian fisherman came into his own through the export of salted cod. How does this happen within the borders of these Western countries? The dollar store. Africa was not a large market for European products compared to other continents, but both buying prices and selling prices were set by European capitalists. That certainly allowed their manufacturers and traders more easy access to the surplus of wealth produced in Africa than they would have had if Africans were in a position to raise the price of their own exports. It's messed up, right? It's truly messed up, because that's why we say we are confronting the system. The system has put you in a position where you cannot afford these goods. Then they've provided a lesser quality, a cheaper, lesser quality product that you can afford, the dollar store. So now you're dependent on it, and you cannot walk away from it because you won't have access to anything. And so what do you do as an African who's interested in tearing down this system? You and other Africans come together to support an African business that will provide affordable goods to you that are made of good quality, that is not exploiting you, that is willing to make a profit that is just enough for them. I at one point I was operating under the rule of 30%. No more than 30% profit margin should an African company be making, so that you can put the rest of that profit towards community. Shipping and banking services. Channels for the exploitation of surplus were not exhausted by the trading companies and the industrial concerns. The shipping companies constituted an exploitative channel that cannot be overlooked. The largest shipping companies were those under the flags of the colonizing nations, especially the British. The shippers were virtually a law unto themselves, being very favorably regarded by their home governments as earners of super profits, as stimulators of industry and trade, as carriers of mail, and as contributors to the navy when war came. African peasants had absolutely no control over the freight rates which were charged, and actually paid more than citizens in other lands. The rate for flour from Liverpool to West Africa was 35 shillings per ton, as compared with only 7.5 shillings from Liverpool to New York. Like, even when they're doing trade with their fellow white folk, they're charging less to them than they are charging to you, a roughly equivalent distance. You see, there's no difference in the distance. Freight rates normally varied with the volume of cargo carried, but the rate for cocoa was established as 50 shillings per ton when amounts exported were small at the beginning of this century, and the same high figure remained when exports increased. Coffee carried from Kenya to New York in the 1950s earned the shippers 280 shillings per ton. Shillings, not dollars. $40, which is $40 at the rate of exchange then, in 1950. Theoretically, it was the merchant who paid the shipper the freight charges. But when you think about the price of coffee cans today, which is anywhere from $12 to 20 something and beyond, right? And you think $40 per ton, how many cans that ton is going to produce? Anyway, theoretically, it was the merchant who paid the shipper the freight charges, but in practical terms, it meant that peasant production was hearing all the costs. Since the merchants bearing, that's a typo there. But in practical terms, it meant that peasant production was bearing all the costs, since the merchants paid out of profits made by buying cheaply from the peasants. Alternatively, while settler planters paid the costs as in Kenya and then regained their profits through exploitation of rural wage labor, shipping companies retained a high profit margin by a practice similar to the pools of the commercial firms. They established what were known as conference lines, which allowed two or more shippers to share the freight loads between themselves on the most favorable basis possible. Their returns on investment were so high and their greed so uncontrollable that even the merchants of the colonizing powers protested. From 1929, like, even their own people protested. From 1929 to 1931, the UAC, backed by Unilever, engaged in an economic war with the West African Lines Conference, comprising the British shipping firm of Elder Dempster, the Holland West African Line, and the German West Africa Line. In that instance, the trading monopoly won a victory over the shipping monopoly. But it was a fight between two elephants, and the grass was trampled all the more. You've heard that saying before, I believe Nyerere is the one that said it. Was it Nyerere or Nkrumah? At the end of it all, the African peasant was the greatest loser because both traders and shippers adjusted their differences by lowering prices of primary products as paid to Africans. In the background of the colonial scene hovering the banks, insurance companies, maritime underwriters, and other financial houses, one can say in the background, because the peasant never dealt directly with such institutions and was generally ignorant of their exploiting functions. We're talking about the Bank of Americas, the Barclays banks, mm, the Chases of the world. We're talking about the AIGs, the Zurichs, and all the shipping companies. The peasant or worker had no access to bank loans because he had no securities or collateral. Banks and finance houses dealt only with other capitalists who could prove to the bankers that whatever happened, the bank would never recover its money and make a profit. In the epoch of imperialism, the bankers became the aristocrats of the capitalist world. So, in other sense, they were very much in the foreground. The amount of surplus produced by African workers and peasants and passing into the hands of metropolitan bankers is quite phenomenal. They registered a return on capital higher even than the mining companies. And each new direct investment that they made spelled further alienation of the fruits of African labor. Furthermore, all investment in the colonies meant, in effect, the involvement of the big finance monopolies, since the smallest trading company was ultimately linked to a big banker. The returns on colonial investment were consistently higher than those in investments in the metropoles. So the financiers stood to benefit from sponsoring colonial enterprise. So all those companies you see in the stock exchange, all of them are where they are as successful as they are because of that African peasant who got on that ground in that mine, who planted that seed, who watered that seed, who weeded that seed, who harvested that product, who packaged it, who helped load it onto the shipping vessels, and it ended up getting there. All the companies in the stock exchange market, all of them are as successful as they are because of Africa and Africans. In the earliest years of colonialism, the banks of Africa were small and relatively independent. This applied to the Banque du Sénégal, started as early as 1853, and to the Bank of British West Africa, which began as an offshoot of the shipping firm of Elder Dempster. However, the great banking houses of Europe, which had carried on remote control of development ever since the 1880s, soon nerved indirectly on the colonial banking scene when the volume of capitalist transactions made this worthwhile. The Banque du Sénégal merged into the Banque de l'Afrique Occidentale, BAO, in 1901, acquiring links with the powerful Bank of Indochina. Yeah. Which in turn was a special creation of several powerful metropolitan French bankers. In 1924, the Banque Commerciale d'Afrique (BCA) emerged in the French territories, linked with the Credit Lyonnais and the BNCI in France. By that time, the Bank of British West Africa had its finance backed by Lloyd's Bank, Lloyd's of London, Westminster Bank, the Standard Bank, Standard Chartered, and the National Provincial Bank, all in England. The other great English banking firm, Barclays, moved directly into Africa. It purchased the Colonial Bank and set it up as Barclays DCO, Dominion and Colonial. The Bank of British West Africa, which became the Bank of West Africa in 1957, and Barclays held between them the lion's share of the banking business of British West Africa, just as French West and Equatorial Africa were shared out between the BAO and the BCA. There was also a union of French and British banking capital in West Africa in 1949 with the formation of the British and French West Africa Bank. French and Belgian exploitation also overlapped in the financial sphere since the Societe Generale had both Belgian and French capital. It supported banks in French Africa and the Congo. Other weaker colonial powers were served by the international banks such as Barclays, and also used their colonial territories as grazing ground for their own national banks. In Libya, the Banco de Roma, the Banco di Napoli operated, while in Portuguese territories the most familiar name was that of the Banco Ultramarino. In Southern Africa, the outstanding banking firm was the Standard Bank of South Africa Limited. Started in 1862 in the Cape Colony by the heads of business houses having close connections with London. Its headquarters were placed in London and it made a fortune out of financing gold and diamond strikes. Financing the strikes! The strikes! Even when the black person arose, they were making money. Shit. Oh. And through handling the loot of Cecil Rhodes and De Beers. By 1895, the Standard Bank spread into Bechuanaland, Rhodesia, and Mozambique, and it was the second British bank to be established in British East Africa. The actual scale of profits was quite formidable. In a book officially sponsored by the Standard Bank, the writer modestly concluded as follows: little attention has been paid in the text of this book to the financial outcome of the Standard Bank's activities. Yet their profitability was an inevitable outcome of survival and was therefore bound to be its primary objective from first to last. So they were trying to survive, is what they're saying? In 1960, the Standard Bank produced a net profit of £1,181,000 and paid a 14% dividend to its shareholders. Most of the latter were in Europe or else were whites in South Africa, while the profit was produced mainly by the black people of South and East Africa. Furthermore, these European banks transferred the reserves of their African branches to the London head office to be invested in the London money market, the stock exchange. The market is there and sustained by Africa. You can cry all you want, white people. I'll give you some napkins to wipe your tears. This was the way in which they most rapidly expatriated African surplus to the metropoles. The first bank to be set up in East Africa in the 1890s was an offshoot of a British bank operating in India. It later came to be called the National and Greenleys. In neighboring Tanganyika, the Germans established the German East African Bank in 1905. But after the First World War, the British had a near monopoly on East African banking. Altogether, 9 foreign banks were in existence in East Africa during the colonial period, some of the big three were national and Greenleys, the Standard Bank, and Barclays, which to this day exist in Africa. Finally, Africa provides an interesting example of how effectively foreign banks served to dispossess Africa of its wealth. Most of the banking and other financial services were rendered to white settlers whose conception of home was always Britain. Consequently, when the white settlers failed, we're talking about settlers. So here's their argument. Maybe Baba Rodney would make it. Let's see. Consequently, when the white settlers felt threatened, he is making it, towards the end of colonial period, they rushed to send their money home to Britain. For example, when the decision to concede self-government to Kenya was taken by the British in 1960, a sum amounting to over $5.5 million was immediately transferred to safety in London by whites in Tanganyika. That sum, like all other remittances by colonial banks, represented the exploitation of African land resources and labor. We go back to De la Mare. De la Mare's descendants decide, Nduku, you're being racist. Nduku, you're discriminated. Nduku, we don't know any other place to call home but Kenya. Oh, but when you're threatened, your money is going to home, which is not Kenya, which is London. So guess what? Since you're sending money home, get the hell out of Africa and go home. The colonial administration as economic exploiter. All right, I think we're going to stop there. It's 7 minutes to 12. We're going to stop there. I need to take a deep breath, go and unwind. We're going to start next week, the colonial administration as economic exploiter. This book is telling us, I'm going to look at your comments in case there are any questions, and just to read your comments for everyone who's listening. This book is telling us what the problem is, but it's not telling us what the problem is for us to just read, put it on the side, and move on and continue supporting this system. It's telling us what the problem is so that we as Africans can come together, because I cannot do it by myself. I literally have lost my job because I'm confronting this system. So I cannot do it by myself. We have to actually, which is why I keep saying, umoja wetu ndio ngao na nguvu yetu. Our unity is our shield and our strength as Africans. We have to unite. Uniting is not just working together. It's working together. It's defending each other, advocating for each other. Y'all who are talking about Palestine, I'm good with that. Let's defend Palestine. But as you defend Palestine, do not forget what's happening in West Africa. Do not forget what's happening in South Africa. Do not forget what's happening in Haiti. Do not forget what's happening in the United States to Black communities. We can chew gum and walk at the same time. Let's keep our... And someone said to me the other day, this was an African person who called me racist the other day. I said, I'm not racist. I'm Black conscious. I am aware of my blackity self. I am looking out for my blackity people. I'm advocating for blackity Black people. That's what I am. Now, if by default, me advocating for Black people because you have a system that has decided white people should be treated better is affecting you, they collateral. But you're the one who set up that system. So tough luck. Get some tissues, wipe your tears, figure out a way you're going to adjust to this new world where Black people have kujichagulia. They're choosing for themselves. They're determining, self-determination. They're determining for themselves. My advice to white folk, my advice to the nations that are resisting the awakening of Africa, and awakening for Africa, not the ones that you're coordinating with the AU, apparently, the Africa we want. Who's the we? Africans, we need to ask, who's the we? In the Africa we want, who is the we? You need to confront these white people who sit and tell you, oh, the Africa we want, 2063. Oh, excuse me, Bill Gates. Who's the we? It's Africa. All right. You've been here for how long, Bill Gates? What have you done for Africa as a collective? Why are we paying excessively for food? Why does Delamere still have land? Bill Gates, I don't hear you advocating for Delamere to sell his land or to give his land back to Kenyans. Bill Gates, I don't hear you advocating for Kenyans to preserve original seeds and to grow them and provide food for them. I don't hear you advocating for that. I hear you advocating for GMO companies. Bill Gates, I don't hear you advocating for Kenyans to start a manufacturing company, for you putting down capital to support them, to start run by Kenyans, for Kenyans, to produce products that they'll determine that they no longer need them manufactured in the US or wherever it is. They'll manufacture them in Kenya by Kenyans, and then they'll sell it to you with the price determined by them. Bill Gates, if you're going to be for the Africa we want, 2063, this is what we're asking for. This is what we all as Africans should ask for. We have to unite because this game cannot be played by individuals. We're going to be crushed. We'll be the next Thomas Sankara's. Someone is hit on the road by a car, you don't know what happened to them, or they were too confrontational when it comes to the system of oppression. And you all ignore it and continue moving. We have to start thinking differently. We have to stop getting comfortable. We have to either seriously want this or just give up and go along and just accept the position of subjugated people. But as long as we're feeling the pain and as long as we want to change, we have to act ourselves. And part of that action is coming together. And you heard yesterday the two youth leaders who were saying this is the work they're doing, these are the barriers they're facing, helping them get over those barriers, helping them continue doing the work despite of those barriers, maybe taking down those barriers by holding your congressmen accountable in the US who are talking about AGOA. But AGOA has these restrictions that prevent Africans from manufacturing within Africa, that prevent Africans from walking away from they used AGOA, from walking away from mtumba, second-hand clothing. When Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda joined, I believe Burundi was part of it. 2016, they wanted to stop the second-hand clothing industry so that they could revive the textile industry in East Africa and bring it back up. The US threatened sanctions. the US threatened taking away the benefits of AGOA, which is duty-free, to those nations if they dared take away the secondhand clothing market. We all have to get serious, and we all have to go. So you people who have representatives in the US House of Representatives need to say to them, hey, what's up with this AGOA? How come the East African countries wanted to stop, you write letters to your congressmen, wanted to stop the sale of secondhand clothing, and the US stopped them from that. They want to build there, especially the ones who are talking about let's support Africa. The mayor of New York, such people. I wish you all well. Thank you for joining me. Let's remember as we go through this tough process, because it's not easy. As you learn the truth, you're confronting yourself. You have to as you get angry, you're getting angry at yourself too, right? So remember to give yourselves grace. I do my best to remember that. Remember to have a good time. Remember to be kind to each other. I do my best to do that as well. And remember to hold each other accountable. Like, we've got to have each other's backs as Africans. I know now from experiences I've had recently, myself included, we're not doing a good job of that. And we need to get better at having each other's backs. Thank you. I'll see you all next week. Again, the Walter Rodney Foundation, Take Action. Visit that website to see what you can do to help them. Thank them again for making the book accessible. Share it, share it, share it. Why are you sharing it? Because Baba Rodney wrote this book and gave this information so that it would be available to the masses of Africans. So you sharing it is making it accessible. Again, we on Kumbukeni are going to start journalism project where we analyze different articles in the papers to break them down to see what these Western media writers are doing, the gymnastics they're going about to build these false narratives on Africa, to critically analyze. We're going to start that on our, to have access to those, you need to be a patron member of Kumbukeni. We would love to offer this for free for everyone. But again, we are in a system where we too need to make ends meet. I cannot provide this information to you if I'm homeless, living under a bridge. I cannot. So in Patreon, if you're a member, and it starts at $3, for the Africans who I know will not be able to afford that $3, for those of you who make a higher income, I just read about how in the West you're paid much more than in Africa, despite the fact that you're exploiting Africa. You can volunteer to sponsor an African to have access to our Patreon. You can send an email to kumbukeni@gmail.com. It's kumbukeni1@gmail.com. You can send an email there and say, hey, Kumbukeni, we want to sponsor any African. We will look out for the African. We'll tell you, we'll respond to your email and tell you, hey, we've chosen this person to have access to the Patreon account. We can reach out to the youth, to the Young African Leaders Forum leaders that we spoke to yesterday. We can reach out to them and say, hey, give us some Africans who want to learn journalism. We have this program that is coming up with Ali Mahdi, being led by Ali Mahdi. Just pick some of the youth from the local. We can have requirements that they must be from local interior Africa who have no access to resources. Get one who's interested in learning journalism and critical analysis and knowing how to analyze these papers. And we can figure out how to give them access to internet and pay their Patreon account for $3 to have access to this class with Ali Mahdi. So you can send us an email on kumbukeni1@gmail.com if you want to support that work. Santeni, siku njema, kwaherini.